I should have quit the day Annie Keller disappeared. That's the thought that keeps circling back whenever I close my eyes and feel the tree line pressing in behind me the way it did that morning. Heavy, watchful, patient. But I didn't quit. I told myself rangers don't run, that people depended on us, that the Smokies weren't alive and waiting to swallow anyone who stared too long into the dark seams between trees. Those were the lies I lived on. Those were the lies that kept me walking trails long after I knew something out here wanted me to stay forever. My name doesn't matter, not anymore. Names fade faster than footprints in these mountains. But I've worn the badge of a national park ranger for 21 years, most of them drifting through the Tennessee side of the Great Smoky Mountains, Cades Cove, Elkmont, Deep Creek, up toward Clingman's Dome when weather allowed. People assume the job is all smiles and trail maps, but most of our work is searching for lost hikers, lost kids, lost dogs, lost minds. The Smokies take things, quietly and without apology. If the land were a person, you'd call it a hoarder. I joined the service out of guilt, if I'm being honest. My younger brother went missing when I was 18. He didn't vanish in these mountains, but in a stretch of hardwood forest not too different from them. We were on a hunting trip. One second he was behind me, the next he wasn't. They blamed a bear or a cougar, but I never heard a cry, never found a trail of blood, never located even a scrap of his jacket. Just silence, clean and complete. And silence like that, it threads itself through you. Eventually, I thought maybe if I spent long enough protecting other people from what I couldn't protect him from, it might even out the scales. It never did. I'd been on duty maybe 8 years when the Keller case hit. Annie was 14. Her family camped near Metcalf Bottoms and decided to hike to the Little Greenbrier schoolhouse. She walked ahead on the trail. They saw her round a bend. Then nothing. No scream, no rustling brush, no slipping gravel. Just gone. I was there for the search. 6 days combing through ridgelines, crawling through rhododendron hells thick enough to skin your knuckles raw. On the third day, I heard what I thought was her voice calling from below a rock outcrop, faint, like she was deep underground. I called out, slid down the slope, pressed my ear to the stone. The voice stopped, but the rock was warm like someone had been breathing on the other side. That was the first time I felt it, the wrongness, the sense that the mountains weren't just hiding things, they were participating. You might think that was the worst of it, but the Smokies are generous with their horrors. The longer you work out here, the more you learn to stop asking questions. Around year 12, I began noticing vibrations in the ground during night patrols. Not like the tremors from far-off thunder or the rumble of a distant truck. These were small, steady pulses like the heartbeat of something buried. Animals avoided those areas. The deer froze and listened. The bears circled wide. Even the insects went silent. Whenever I radioed it in, dispatch told me it was probably geological settling, but rocks don't breathe, and that's what it felt like under my boots. Breathing. By year 15, I started smelling things that didn't belong in the season. In February, when the air should smell like frozen bark and dead leaves, I'd catch the scent of wet fur. In July, when everything is humid and green, something like burning hair drifted through the trees. You learn smells out here. You learn what animal scat smells like, what a rotting deer smells like, what human decomposition smells like if you've been on enough recovery missions, which I have. But nothing prepared me for the odor that hovered one morning near an empty hunting cabin tucked off a maintenance road near Tremont. It smelled like fresh blood in snow, cold, metallic, almost clean, but there was no snow. Middle of summer. The heat was vicious. My breath still fogged as if the air around the cabin was winter. I filed reports. They went nowhere. Then came last winter, the event that finally cracked something inside me. The reason I'm telling this story at all, even though every instinct tells me to shut up and pretend none of it happened. It began with a call around 4 a.m. A solo backpacker hadn't returned from a route he'd taken up near the Boneset Ridge fire tower. The man's name was Harris, late 30s, experienced, had done dozens of long-distance hikes. His GPS pinged once just before dusk the night before, then flatlined. His car was still at the trailhead. Temperatures had dropped into the teens. Snowfall had picked up overnight. We didn't have the luxury of waiting for daylight. I grabbed my pack, radio, and snowshoes. The sky was still black when I started up the trail, my headlamp carving narrow tunnels of light through the snowfall. The woods felt attentive. That's the best word I have for it. Like the trees were leaning slightly in my direction, listening to my footsteps. It's ridiculous, I know. Trees don't lean like that unless the wind hits them just right. But there was no wind. The snowfall was straight down. About a mile in, I found the first set of tracks. Harris's boots angled off the trail, deeper into the forest. No sign of struggle. No animal prints, no slipping. Just a confident turn like he'd seen something interesting and followed it. The snow around the tracks hadn't accumulated the way it should have. It was disturbed in a pattern I didn't recognize, like faint circular impressions, each one the size of my hand. They weren't boot prints. They weren't animal prints. They were too evenly spaced, too symmetrical. I crouched down and brushed the snow away. Underneath was hard-packed earth, warm enough to melt the snow on contact. That's when I heard the breathing. Behind me. Not animal breathing. The cadence was wrong. Too slow. Too deliberate. One inhale every few seconds, followed by a pause that stretched too long. I turned, sweeping my headlamp across the trees. Nothing. But the sound didn't stop. It came from somewhere close. Too close, like someone was standing just behind a trunk too narrow to conceal a person. I forced myself to keep moving, rationalizing, like always. Maybe an echo. Maybe my own breath bouncing off the trees. Maybe I was tired, but the breathing followed, always a few feet behind, always syncing with the rhythm of mine as if mocking it. Half an hour later, the tracks led me to a clearing where the snow had been disturbed in a wide circle. I thought maybe Harris had set up a bivouac or a small fire, but there were no signs of camping. No ashes, no gear, no footprints except his. He had walked into the center of the circle and never walked out. My radio crackled uselessly. Static, just static. Then the trees around the clearing shifted. Not in the wind, there wasn't any. They shuddered, like something large had passed between them, brushing against their trunks. I felt a pressure in the air, heavy, pushing against my chest, like invisible hands were probing the shape of me. The temperature swung wildly, a wave of heat blasting through the clearing, followed by a gut punch of cold so sharp it stabbed through my jacket. And then I heard it. A voice. My brother's voice. Calling my name from beneath the snow. I dropped to my knees so fast, I barely felt the cold bite through my pants. My gloves scraped across the snow as I clawed at it, pushing aside handfuls until my fingers struck the ground beneath. Frozen earth. Roots. A thin crust of ice. Nothing else. But the voice kept rising from below the surface, muffled, strained, exactly the way I remembered it sounding the day my brother vanished. Not a ghostly imitation, an exact recreation down to the nervous crack in his tone he tried to hide at 14. I whispered his name before I could stop myself. The moment the word left my mouth, the voice stopped. Silence, absolute and smothering. My heartbeat was the only sound I could hear, a hammering drum buried in my chest. The trees stood motionless around the clearing, as if waiting to see what I'd do next. A rational mind would have stepped back, marked the site, radio dispatch, called in a ground-penetrating radar unit or at least another ranger. But reason wasn't the first thing that returned to me. It was dread. The kind I thought I'd grown immune to after years of body recoveries and late-night searches. This wasn't something I knew how to respond to. It wasn't something any ranger is trained for. When the voice returned, it didn't come from beneath me. It came from the tree line behind me. My brother calling my name again, brighter, clearer, closer. I stood so fast the blood rushed to my head, turning the world white around the edges. My breath clouded in front of me, but this time the air froze the vapor instantly into brittle crystals that hovered before falling like dust. The tree line looked normal, dense, silent, familiar. But the call came a third time from deeper inside the woods. Not a scream, not a plea. More like he was calling me in the casual way he used to when he wandered off the trail while hunting mushrooms, waiting for me to catch up. I told myself to ignore it, to focus, to think like a ranger, not a grieving brother. But the sound burrowed under every wall I'd spent my adult life building, and I found myself walking toward it, step by step, like a sleepwalker. The snow swallowed my boots with soft crunches. My headlamp swayed across trunks and branches, each one painted in a pale glow that made the woods feel artificial, like a stage set waiting for an actor to appear. The breathing that had followed me earlier was gone, replaced by small, irregular clicks, a sound like pebbles tapping against each other just out of sight. The voice called again, slightly to my left this time. I pivoted, but my lamp only caught empty forest. The underbrush trembled once, sharply, the sound like something had brushed through it. Then all movement stopped. That's when the smell hit me. Burned hair, acrid, choking, smothering the cold air. I pulled my collar over my nose. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong with the temperature. The heat was coming from a single direction, radiating from somewhere just beyond the next cluster of trees. I pushed through and found the entrance. Not to a cave, not to an old mine, just a hole in the ground, almost perfectly circular, maybe 6 feet wide, steaming as if someone had poured boiling water into the earth. The snow around it had melted into a slushy ring that glistened in my lamplight. The smell of burnt hair was strongest here, mixed with something else, something metallic and clean and terrifyingly familiar. Blood. But the hole wasn't a pit. It was a tunnel, descending smoothly into darkness like the throat of some enormous organism that had risen to the surface for a breath before burrowing back down. A low vibration pulsed from within, faint but steady, thrumming in the soles of my boots. I should have backed away, called for backup, marked the coordinates and waited for the sun. But then I heard it, a weak, exhausted whisper rising from the tunnel. Help me. Not my brother's voice this time. Harris's. The missing hiker. Every rule in my body split in half. One part of me, the ranger, knew that entering an unverified tunnel system during snowfall, alone, without ropes or backup, was suicide. The other part of me, the part that still lived in the shadow of my brother's empty grave, knew I couldn't leave someone down there. Not again. I turned on my secondary lamp, clipped it to my vest, and stepped to the edge. Warm air billowed upward, brushing my face with the softness of breath. The snow at my feet turned watery, bleeding through my socks. I knelt, trying to peer deeper. The tunnel curved immediately, swallowing the beam of my light. Something about the smoothness of the walls bothered me. They weren't rock. They weren't dirt either. They were textured, like something had carved them with impossible precision. Parallel grooves ran along the inside, faint but deliberate, too even, too perfect. My radio crackled suddenly. But it wasn't dispatch. It was my own voice, weak, hoarse, calling my name. I froze. My hand hovered over the radio, breath caught in my throat. The static shifted, then the voice returned, this time deeper in tone, warped by distance, but unmistakably me. At first, I thought the radio had malfunctioned, maybe playing back an old recording. But I'd never said those specific words, and the voice didn't sound like it was coming through the speaker. It sounded like it was coming from the tunnel. My stomach twisted so violently I had to steady myself. For the first time in years, I felt the exact sensation I'd felt at 18. My legs going hollow, my breath refusing to settle, a kind of primal dread that stripped every complicated emotion down to its most basic form, fear. I turned off my radio, and something in the tunnel exhaled, a slow, heavy rush of air that puffed upward, warm enough to thaw the ice clinging to my beard. The smell of sulfur wrapped around me, clinging to my jacket like smoke. I could swear something in the darkness shifted, just beyond the bend. Too slow to be wind, too intentional to be settling earth. That's when the ground beneath me vibrated again, a steady pulsing rhythm. Thud, 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 not like a heartbeat this time, more like footsteps. And they were moving upward, closer. The temperature around me surged, cold, hot, like the forest itself was inhaling and exhaling through the earth, each breath bending the air in ways that made my lamp flicker. Snowflakes hovering in front of my face twisted and melted midair, evaporating before they hit the ground. I staggered back, boots slipping in the slush. The breathing I'd heard earlier began again, but now it came from multiple directions, from the tunnel, the trees, the air itself, layered like a chorus of lungs inhaling in unison. Then everything went still. So still I could hear the delicate crack of ice forming in my water bottle. From the darkness of the tunnel came a single whisper, spoken quietly, evenly, like someone who had been standing just inside the bend for a very, very long time. You kept walking. My heart punched my ribs, because that's what my brother said the last time I spoke to him, the last thing he ever said. He'd been teasing me, smiling, laughing, telling me I walked too fast. You kept walking. You didn't wait. The voice repeated it, exactly the same. I backed away until my pack brushed the trunk of a tree. The forest felt taller, narrower, distorted, as if the trees were stretching toward the hole, bending faintly like plants reaching for sunlight. The snow muffled everything except the whisper rising again, more insistent this time. You kept walking. You kept walking. My light flickered as if something massive had passed in front of it for a split second. Then the whisper stopped, replaced by Harris's voice, much closer than before. Please, don't leave me. My legs moved on instinct. I turned and pushed through the trees, nearly stumbling. The forest seemed to shift around me, subtly rearranging its layout. The trees felt closer together than they had minutes before. My headlamp threw frantic shadows that stretched too long, bending at angles light shouldn't create. Behind me, the breathing grew louder, slowing. I didn't look back. Not yet. I focused on the trail I knew should have been ahead. The slope, the marker stump, the split where the ridge trail intersected the fire road. I repeated the landmarks in my mind like prayer beads. The forest had other plans. When I broke through the trees, I wasn't on the trail. I was back in the clearing, the same circle in the snow, the same tunnel waiting in the center, steaming gently like a mouth waiting to be fed. And this time, there were footprints next to it. Fresh, human, bare, leading down into the hole. The footprints were small, too small for Harris. Bare feet, narrow, with a faint arch. The kind of prints a teenager might leave while running across wet sand. For a moment, my brain refused to accept what it was seeing. The cold should have blackened skin in seconds. No one should have been barefoot up here. No one alive. I don't know how long I stood there staring. The snow around the prints hadn't melted. That was the part that unnerved me the most. Bare feet should have left wide, slushy depressions. Heat. Liquid edges. But these impressions were sharp, crisp, as if something cold, colder than the snow, had stepped through. The tunnel exhaled another wave of breath. The steam rising from it curled around my legs, brushing against the fabric of my pants like fingers. I whispered, "Annie?" The sound scraped my throat on the way out. Saying her name felt like peeling back a scar that never healed. The footprints did not respond. But deep in the tunnel, something shifted, softly, patiently, like someone adjusting their weight. I took one step back, then another, and the ground trembled. Not violently, just enough to make the snow ripple at the edges of the tunnel like a thin skin stretching over an opening. I needed out. I needed daylight. Backup, logic, anything but this. I turned and started toward the tree line again, repeating the trail markers in my head, the familiar sequence I'd followed hundreds of times. But as soon as I entered the woods, I felt it. The angle was wrong. The incline steeper. The trees too close. The undergrowth thicker. The darkness different. It's strange how quickly a forest you've known your whole life can shift into something unrecognizable. Just a few degrees of difference and your internal compass crumbles. Here, in this warped silence, nothing matched what should have been there. I pushed forward anyway, the forest scraping my coat, branches tugging at my pack. I kept my headlamp up, sweeping the trunks. Every so often I caught a flash of something pale between the trees, maybe snow on bark, maybe a patch of frost, maybe something else. My lamp flickered each time I saw it, like it refused to illuminate whatever stood there. Behind me, the breathing began again. Steady. Slow, matching my pace. I didn't want to look. Not because I thought something would be there, but because I was terrified nothing would be. The idea of being followed by something I couldn't see was worse than any creature my mind tried to conjure. I tightened the strap on my radio, even though I knew it was useless, and moved faster. The forest should have opened into a slope by now. I should have been heading downhill. Instead, the ground tilted upward, the snow deepening around my ankles. My lungs burned from the cold air. My thighs trembled. The woods pressed in tighter. Then the smell hit me again. Blood and snow, but stronger this time. So strong I tasted it on my tongue, a copper sting that made me swallow hard. I wiped my mouth, expecting to see red on my glove. Nothing. The smell pulled me forward before I registered what I was doing. I stepped into a narrow corridor of trees, the branches forming an arch overhead. The snow here was thinner, patchy, exposing raw, dark soil beneath. Something glinted. Metal. I crouched and brushed away the loose flakes. A badge. A National Park Service badge. Old. Scratched. Half buried. The pin bent out of shape. I lifted it and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold weather. There were numbers etched into the back, corroded but readable. 2941. I knew that number. Every ranger in the Smokies did. It belonged to Ranger David Holt, missing since 1998. He'd gone out on a winter search alone, against protocol, chasing reports of a light seen in the backcountry. They found his pack 3 days later. Torn open. Everything scattered. No blood. No body. Just a single bare footprint that stopped abruptly mid-stride, as if he'd stepped into the air. No one had ever recovered his badge. Until now. My stomach pitched. I dropped the badge and stood so quickly my headlamp swung wildly. The trees seemed to lean closer, knitting themselves tighter into a wall around me. I backed away, and my heel struck something soft under the snow. A shape. Long. Still. My breath froze. I crouched again and swept the snow aside with trembling hands. A jacket sleeve. Green. Faded. Thick wool typical of winter issue. Older design, the type Rangers wore decades ago. My fingers brushed something colder than ice beneath the fabric. A wrist. Pale. Stiff. Bare of glove. I jerked back so fast I fell onto the snow. My vision blurred around the edges. The forest seemed to tilt. The body, at least part of one, lay half buried, as if it had been dropped or left or gently placed there. The skin along the wrist was flawless. No decay, no frostbite, no animal damage. Just preserved, like the mountains had kept it. A movement flickered across the corner of my eye. Something stood between the trees. Tall, thin, facing me. Still as a post. Its outline shimmered, like heat rising off asphalt, even though the air was freezing. My lamp trembled as I held at the figure. The shape didn't change, didn't move. It was human-shaped. Broad shoulders, narrow waist, long legs, but stretched just slightly too tall, as if proportions had been guessed rather than formed. I blinked. It was gone. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around. My beam landed on empty forest. Snow drifted lazily. The breathing drew nearer, swelling into the shape of a circle around me. The smell of sulfur thickened. My vision warped, the trees bending at impossible angles. I needed to run. Anywhere. I forced my legs to move. I broke through the corridor of trees and stumbled down a slope I didn't remember existing. My boots slid. I grabbed at roots and branches. The forest kept changing, funneling me through paths too narrow or too steep or too twisted to be natural. That's when the whispering began. Not words at first, just sound, hushed, rhythmic, like pages turning underwater. I pressed forward, stumbling through a curtain of vines that hadn't been there moments before. The whispering grew clearer. Multiple voices, layered. Some I recognized, some I didn't. My brother's voice, Harris's voice, a woman's voice, young, soft, trembling. Annie, maybe, or someone else the mountains had taken. Then the final voice spoke. My own, calling my name, calling me to come closer, begging, crying, pleading. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. The voice wasn't ahead of me, it was below me. I angled my lamp. The forest floor had cracked open. A thin fissure, only a few inches wide, ran along the ground at my feet. Warm vapor escaped through it in slow breaths. The whispering rose from deep inside the crack, echoing upward from some impossible depth. I leaned closer before I could stop myself. Inside, something moved. Not a creature. Not a human. Just movement. Like something enormous shifting far beneath the surface, turning its attention upward, aware of my presence. The ground pulsed once beneath my hand, then the whispering stopped, all at once. Replaced by silence, so absolute it felt like pressure. I stood, legs shaking, and turned to run, only to find myself staring at the clearing again. The tunnel, the footprints, and now, a second set of footprints beside the first. Larger, fresh, leading out of the tunnel. And stopping right behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. I felt warmth on the back of my neck, breath, slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. The breath on my neck was so warm it prickled the tiny hairs along my skin, a kind of heat that didn't belong in the dead of winter, didn't belong anywhere in these mountains. My muscles locked, my throat tightened until I could barely swallow. The world narrowed to a tunnel of cold air and the slow rise and fall of something behind me, something with lungs, something with intent, something that knew my name. I forced myself not to turn. Predators, human or animal, often move only when you move. That's what I told myself as I stared at the snow in front of me, at the two sets of footprints, the smaller ones leading down into the tunnel, the larger ones coming out and stopping inches behind my heels. The snow around those prints wasn't melted. That bothered me more than anything else. If someone or something had walked through barefoot, the snow should have liquefied. But the depressions were clean, crisp, edged in frost, as if the feet that made them were colder than the air itself. Behind me, the breathing deepened. Each exhale brushed the back of my jacket like the inside of a furnace. I lifted my hand slowly, very slowly, toward my radio. Even if it only produced static, I needed to try. The breathing paused. A second of silence, then a voice, right behind my ear, whispered, "Don't." I jerked forward, stumbling into the snow. My lamp swung wildly, illuminating the trees in frantic arcs. The clearing spun around me like a carousel of black branches and white ground. I caught myself before falling completely, boots digging into the slush. When I whipped around to face whatever had spoken, there was nothing there. Just the tunnel, just the snow, just the prints. The forest held its breath. My heart hammered so violently I felt it in my teeth. I stepped backward, one careful foot at a time, not taking my eyes off the clearing. My breath fogged in front of me, but this time the vapor moved against the wind, drifting sideways toward the tunnel instead of upward. The tunnel inhaled. The mist vanished into its darkness like it had been sucked inside. I didn't think. I ran. My feet hammered the ground, snow spraying upward in white plumes. My headlamp bobbed and shook. The trees blurred into streaks. The forest floor pitched beneath me as though the earth were shifting. The breathing followed, no longer behind me, but all around me, echoing from trunks and branches, from under the snow, from the air itself. The sound vibrated inside my ribs. A voice called my name. My brother's voice. Then Harris's. Then the young girl's again. Then my own. I ran harder. Branches whipped my face. My breath tore in and out of my chest. My lungs burned. The forest warped. Paths curving where they should have been straight, inclines rising where valleys should have dipped. My memories of the terrain twisted in my mind. I felt like I was running through a place I'd known my whole life and a place I'd never seen before at the same time. Somewhere ahead, the trees thinned. Light, real light, moonlight, filtered through the gaps. I shoved through a tangle of rhododendron, the leaves slapping wet against my shoulders, and burst onto a ridge. The snow here was untouched, pristine. The moon hung pale and hollow above the Smokies, casting long silver shadows across the landscape. I could see the faint outline of the fire tower far off across the valley. Then the ground trembled. A low vibration shivered up through my boots, steady, rhythmic, like a slow pulse. It grew stronger. The snow between the trees behind me rippled like something was moving beneath it, some massive shape sliding under the crust, pushing upward, buckling the surface as it came. I staggered backward along the ridge. The snow 30 feet behind me cracked. Then another crack, closer. The forest buckled. Something was rising. I didn't wait to see it. I slipped along the ridge, feet sliding dangerously close to the drop-off. The slope beneath me plunged into darkness. Jagged rocks, fallen timber, dead leaves buried under layers of ice. One wrong step would send me tumbling. A whisper floated from the trees below the ridge. Not from behind me this time. From ahead. A single word. Stop. I froze. Not because I obeyed it, because everything in my body seized at once. When you hear your own voice speaking from the darkness ahead of you, syllable for syllable, tone for tone, perfect in every way, the mind goes blank. My lamp tilted downward. Something stood on the slope, tall, still facing me. My own silhouette. The same jacket, the same lamp, the same stance. Only the face was wrong, the features blurred, the way reflections blur when rippling water distorts your outline. My double raised a hand slowly as though signaling me to wait. The snow behind me cracked again, louder, closer. My decision was instant. I leapt sideways into the brush, scrambling down the ridge at a reckless angle. Ice tore at my gloves. Branches whipped my legs. I slid on my hip, boots kicking up sprays of frozen dirt. Something heavy moved behind me. Too heavy, too close. A dull thud shook the ground. I didn't look back. I reached the base of the ridge and ran again, weaving through the trees. The forest felt alive, shifting, adjusting, pushing me somewhere, not randomly, not chaotically, but with purpose. The temperature swung wildly. One moment the air stung with cold, the next it burned like summer asphalt. Scents hit me in waves. Wet fur, blood and snow, sulfur, rotting leaves, clean skin, smoke. The voices changed too. Some whispered, some moaned, some laughed, some just breathed. And some cried. Childlike. Hopeless. Empty. I forced myself through the darkness until a familiar shape rose ahead, the old fire road. I almost collapsed in relief. I knew this curve. I knew this grade. I'd walked it 100 times. The road cut through the trees like a scar. If I followed it downhill, it would eventually dump me near the main trailhead. From there, I could radio dispatch, call search teams, explain something. My boots hit the road. I sprinted. The forest leaned in on both sides of the old dirt track, branches forming a narrow throat overhead. My lamp threw frantic shadows across the ruts. My breathing was ragged. Every few steps I glanced behind me. Nothing. No movement. No figures. No footprints. Just my own tracks trailing behind me. I slowed, not trusting it, but needing to catch my breath. The road dipped, then curved slightly right. The trees ahead parted just enough to reveal a light, faint, warm, swaying gently. The fire tower. I exhaled, relief washing over me in a rush. A ranger, the night lookout, must have set a lantern on the railing or switched on the external floodlight. I'd been up there dozens of times during night patrols. It was safe, it was elevated, it had radio access. I forced my tired legs into one last push. The road leveled out into a clearing at the base of the fire tower. The structure loomed above me, metal, skeletal, its stairs winding up into the night. A soft glow spilled down from the top platform. I took a few steps toward the stairway, then stopped cold. The light wasn't lantern light. It was fire, a small flame burning steadily in the center of the top platform. No movement, no shadows of someone tending it, just a single flame, flickering in a perfectly windless night. My stomach twisted violently. There was no one assigned to the tower tonight. No lookout, no ranger, and no one, not a volunteer, not a hiker, would climb a frozen tower ladder in the middle of a snowstorm to light a fire on top of it. I took a step backward. The flame flared slightly, rising just enough to illuminate a shape behind it. Someone was standing at the railing, looking down at me. My breath hitched. The figure was barely visible, that like just a silhouette wavering behind the fire, but the shape was unmistakable. It was me. Same height, same build, same posture, leaning on the railing, watching. I stumbled. My lamp flickered, then steadied. The silhouette didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call out, just stared. Then something at the base of the tower creaked. I swung my lamp downward. Footprints. Bare. Small. Leading to the stairs. And another to them. Large, bare, fresh, leading down the first few steps. stopping in the snow right in front of me. The bare footprints at my feet were so close I could have stepped into them without moving. The edges were sharp, clean, holding their shape in the snow like impressions pressed into wet plaster. They hadn't begun to fill, which meant whoever or whatever made them stood here seconds before I arrived. My breath froze mid-exhale. I lifted my lamp toward the tower again. The figure, my silhouette, was gone. The flame on the platform fluttered once, as if disturbed by movement, then steadied. Heat shimmered upward, bending the edges of the structure the way asphalt bends in summer. But where the light fell, the metal looked wrong. Pale, too smooth, reflecting back distorted versions of the surrounding trees like faces pressed against glass. Snow fell silently around me. The wind didn't touch the flame. Nothing made sense. A sound whispered behind me, soft, barely there. The crunch of snow under a single footstep. I spun, heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing but trees and falling snow. The towers of bark looked tall and black, rising like ribs from the earth. My lamp panned across them, and for a moment, just a moment, I swore I saw faces carved in the trunks. Not human faces, not clear ones. Just impressions, as though the bark folded itself into eyes and mouths, and then unfolded again before my brain could register their shapes. I swallowed, breath shaking. I wanted to run. My entire body screamed for it. But the ranger in me, the trained part, forced a moment of stillness. Forced breath in, breath out. I had a structure. I had elevation. I had radio access at the top. I had a potential vantage point. Running blind through a forest that changed around me was suicide. The tower was the only logical option, even if logic had begun to feel irrelevant tonight. My boots creaked as I stepped onto the first metal rung. The steel was warm, in winter, in a snowstorm. Metal this exposed should have been freezing cold, so cold skin fuses to it instantly. Instead, it felt like it had been sitting in sunlight for hours. I jerked my hand away out of instinct. The warmth remained on my palm. I hesitated. Behind me, the snow crunched again. One slow step, then another. The sound was wrong, deliberate, controlled, as if whoever approached wanted me to hear them but not see them. I grabbed the railing again, warmth or not, and climbed. The metal vibrated faintly under my boots, not with wind, but with rhythm. A pulse, a slow beat traveling through the steel into my bones. The higher I climbed, the stronger it felt, like the tower itself was inhaling and exhaling through the metal frame. Halfway up, I heard breathing below me. Human breathing. Slow, steady, not panicked like mine. I didn't look down. I climbed faster. The flame above cast flickering shadows across the ladder cage. The fire burned strangely bright, white at the center, edges tinged with a faint blue glow. It made the metal look slick, almost liquid. Every step upward felt like pushing against a pressure that grew thicker, denser, heavier. By the time I reached the top platform, my lungs felt bruised. The moment my foot stepped onto the wood, the flame dimmed, as if acknowledging my presence. The air around it shimmered. My own shadow danced across the railing in jagged, stretched shapes that didn't match the angle of the firelight. I stood perfectly still, listening, waiting. Nothing moved on the platform except the flame. But the railing had changed. Fresh handprints melted into the frost on the metal. Several. All different sizes. Some small like a child's. Some larger. Some with long, thin fingers. One set of handprints matched mine exactly, right down to the small scar across my middle knuckle from when I'd caught it on barbed wire as a teenager. The prints were warm. Steam rose from them. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. Something had been here, recently, and I had followed it. A crack echoed from the forest below, a branch snapping under weight, then another. The ground shifted in the moonlight, snow rippling in a line that cut through the trees like something massive was pushing through from underneath. My throat tightened. I forced myself to approach the flame. Up close, it didn't look like a normal fire at all. The wood beneath it, if it was wood, was unburned, untouched. The flame hovered just above the surface, feeding on nothing, anchored to nothing. Heat radiated from it in irregular waves that made my eyes water, something reflected in that heat shimmer. Movement behind me. I turned so fast I nearly slipped. Something stood on the lowest platform of the tower, far below. Tall, thin, staring upward. My lamp's beam hit it and distorted, as though the light bent around the figure instead of illuminating it. Its head tilted with slow, unnatural precision. It began to climb. The metal ladder creaked as weight shifted onto it, but the creak sounded wrong, drawn out, stretched, like the sound was passing through underwater. Each rung it touched vibrated through the structure, a tremor climbing toward me. I stepped back from the railing, nearly brushing against the flame. The heat pulsed against my spine. Then the figure stopped, halfway up the ladder, still, silent, watching. My lamp flickered wildly. The figure lifted one hand and pressed it to the rung. A handprint glowed faintly on the metal. It was identical to mine. My stomach lurched, my breath caught. A cold sweat crawled across my neck. The thing, whatever it was, moved again. But not upward, down, retreating one rung at a time, slowly, carefully, as if descending into the earth rather than climbing down a tower. Its shape dissolved into the darkness beneath the platform. The last thing I saw before the forest swallowed it was the reflection of my own lamp in the outline of its face, my face, twisted into something expressionless, hollow, drained. Silence settled over the tower again, total silence, the kind that sinks its teeth into your nerves. I exhaled shakily, but the breath that came out of me wasn't mine. It wasn't the right rhythm, wasn't the right pitch. It sounded like someone standing behind me exhaling at the exact same time. I spun around. No one. Just the flame. Just the platform. Just the endless black slope on all sides. I pressed my hands against the back of my jacket, feeling for breath, for warmth, for anything. The air was still, too still. Even the fire didn't sway. I felt eyes on me from the woods, from the stairs, from below the platform. Eyes in places eyes shouldn't be. I needed to get down, to leave the tower, to put as much distance between me and that tunnel as possible. I stepped toward the stairs. A voice drifted upward, not a whisper this time, a calm, even tone. Harris's voice, coming from the base of the tower. You shouldn't have come here. I froze. A second voice joined it. Young, fragile. Annie, it's looking for you. Then my brother's voice. We told you not to come back. Then my own voice, right beneath me. You kept walking. The tower shook as something began climbing again, faster this time, much faster. I grabbed the railing, heart battering my ribs, breath stuck in my throat. The footsteps raced upward, metal rattling, wood groaning, the entire structure trembling under the force of something too heavy and too fast to be human. I backed toward the flame. The footsteps were seconds away, 5 feet, 4, 3, 2. The fire surged behind me, white and blinding, and a hand, bare, cold, impossibly long, hooked over the top rung. The hand gripped the top rung like it had grown from the metal itself. Pale, frostbitten, fingers too long, joints bending with a soft, wet crackle. The knuckles bulged like something was forcing its way out from the inside. I stumbled back until heat from the hovering flame seared the back of my neck, but I didn't dare turn my back on that hand. It gripped tighter. The metal groaned. Then, slowly, deliberately, a second hand rose up beside the first. Not climbing. Pulling. Dragging its body upward like it weighed far more than its limbs could support. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. My mouth moved, throat tightened, but my voice stayed trapped inside me like something held it back. My breathing was ragged, uneven, like I had to relearn it. The top of a head emerged, dark hair matted with what looked like half-melted snow, skin pale as moonlit water. But it wasn't just pale. It was flat, untextured, smooth like someone had carved a face but gave up halfway through. The thing lifted higher, and then it looked at me. I don't know how it looked at me. Its eye sockets were only faint indentations, its mouth a shallow impression without lips, but I felt its attention like a weight, like someone pressing a cold palm against my sternum and pushing slowly inward. My lamp flickered, then died completely. Only the unnatural flame behind me remained. The creature froze at the top rung, its head tilted too far to one side, vertebrae popping like bubble wrap. Then it turned its face toward the hovering flame. The fire dimmed, and the temperature dropped so fast the moisture in my breath crystallized midair. No wind, No sound, just that expanding cold. The creature inhaled, a long, slow, shuddering inhale. The flame fluttered inward, drawn toward it, like the fire itself was being breathed in. The platform vibrated beneath my boots as if the entire structure was bracing against something. I felt the cold push into me, threading down my spine like needles. Something brushed my ankle. I jerked my leg upward instinctively, but nothing was there. The cold deepened. My vision blurred at the edges. My heartbeat slowed, fighting the weight pressing inward from every angle. The flame guttered again, shrinking to a fist-sized glow. I forced my body to move, forced myself to step away from the flame, away from the center of the platform, toward the railing, toward air, toward escape. Below, the forest moved. I don't mean branches, or animals, or wind. I mean the forest moved. The trees swayed in perfect unison, all leaning slightly in my direction as though attentive, listening, waiting. Snow shook loose in synchronized cascades that landed without sound. The creature's head snapped back toward me. It exhaled. A rush of frigid air blasted against my chest. My lungs seized and burned as though someone had emptied a winter river directly into me. I dropped to one knee, clutching at my ribs, struggling to breathe around the crushing cold. My vision doubled, tripled. The platform warped like I was looking through heat mirage and frost at the same time, edges bending inward. The railings pulsed faintly with that same heartbeat rhythm I'd felt climbing up. The flame guttered again and went out. Darkness swallowed everything. I don't know how long the tower stayed in pitch black. Seconds? Minutes? My sense of time dissolved into the cold. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe too hard. I waited for the creature to grab me, pull me off the platform, drag me down into the trees, into the tunnel, into whatever darkness lived beneath this place. A faint sound rose in the void. A rasp. A whisper. No, breathing. Right in front of me. The creature was inches away. I could feel its exhale on my face, cold and wrong like air from a sealed cave. Its presence pressed against me, studying me the way you'd study a shape in fog, deciding whether it was alive or a trick of light. A voice broke through the dark. My own voice. Let it in. The rasp of the creature moved closer. Let it in. My fingers clawed blindly across the platform until they found the outline of the flame's wooden base. I felt warmth. Faint, fading, but still there. My hand trembled as I hovered over it. Another breath from the creature slid across my skin. Let it in. I slammed my palm down. The flame exploded back to life, white hot, blinding, erupting upward in a column that scorched the air. The creature recoiled, shrieking a sound so sharp and layered it tore through the metal frame like a vibrating saw. My ears rang instantly. The platform shook violently. The creature staggered backward, collapsing against the railing with a sickening crunch. Its limbs bent wrong, angles too sharp, twisting as though its bones didn't know which direction they were supposed to go. The firelight hit its face, and for the first time I saw detail. It wasn't smooth. It was unfinished. Incomplete. Like a mask carved from something soft, still growing. Its eye sockets deepened, darkened, widening into pits. A mouth formed gradually, stretching into an expression that wasn't a scream and wasn't a smile, just an opening, a void. The flame surged higher, wrapping the creature in its glare. Something inside the creature split. Not physically, audibly. The noise was like ice cracking under a lake, a deep resonant snap that shuddered through the platform. The creature lunged, not toward me, but over the railing, throwing itself into the void below with unnatural force. It hit the snow without sound, and vanished. Not ran, not rolled, vanished. The snow where it landed remained perfectly smooth, unmarked. No depression, no disturbance, no trace. I stared down into the dark, chest heaving, until the flame behind me flickered violently. The tower's heartbeat returned. Thump, thump, thump. The flame was shrinking again, as if whatever formed it was dying, collapsing inward. The forest leaned again, trunks creaking like they were bending closer. I didn't wait for the flame to go out again. I bolted. Down the stairs, gripping the too warm metal so hard my skin throbbed. The forest floor felt unstable under my boots, as if something massive moved underground, shifting the earth in slow waves. Halfway down the staircase, I heard footsteps above me. Not running. Not stalking. Matching mine. Exactly. Every step I took, something took the same step in perfect rhythm directly overhead, like a shadow glued to my movements. I didn't look up. I couldn't. If I saw a second version of myself staring down, I'd freeze or fall or lose whatever sanity I had left. Branches cracked deeper in the woods. Voices threaded through the trees. Harris, Annie, my brother, my own voice, all overlapping, all whispering the same fractured sentence. It's almost here. The earth trembled. The forest exhaled, an enormous, slow gust of cold air that rippled the snow outward in concentric rings. I hit the bottom of the ladder and sprinted toward the maintenance shed, slipping through the snow, lungs burning, legs moving faster than thought. The trees bent inward as I ran, narrowing the path, snow falling around me in thick, choking sheets. The shed's door slammed shut behind me with a metallic clang. Darkness swallowed the interior. I collapsed against the wall, breathing in sharp, uneven gasps. Outside, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, a knock on the door. Soft, measured, fingernails lightly tapping the metal like testing its thickness. Tap, tap, tap. A voice came right next to the doorframe. My voice. You should have stayed in the tunnel. Something pressed its palm against the metal, slowly dragging across it from top to bottom. The vibrations crawled through the wall into my teeth. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep quiet. The dragging paused. The voice whispered again, quieter now. It found you. I didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move. Minutes passed, maybe more, before the cold outside slowly eased. The footsteps faded, the forest settled. Eventually, I opened the door. Nothing was there. No prints. No shadows. Just snow falling softly between the trees as if the night had never been anything but ordinary. But the forest was watching. I could feel it. And the way a predator watches prey long after the chase ends. And I knew in a way that left no room for denial, that something in the Great Smoky Mountains walked with my shape now. Something unfinished, something waiting, something patient. The wilderness keeps what it wants, and it never gives it back. I've learned that in the woods, the truth never roars at you outright. It murmurs, it slides between the pines, brushing your skin like a cold fingertip, waiting for the moment you finally stop pretending you don't feel it. And I'll tell you now, my story didn't begin with a scream or a missing person report. It began with a silence so heavy, it pressed into my chest like a hand trying to stop my breath. My name is Mark, 43 years old, born in a valley where people still trust their instincts more than their phones. I've spent the last 15 years working as a forest ranger in the Northern Rockies, patrolling an area most folks only pass through on their way to somewhere safer. Locals call this land the Ridge, but old-timers, and there aren't many left, have another name for it. They call it the Keep. When I was younger, I assumed it meant the Ridge acted like a stronghold, protecting the valley from winter storms. But after what I've lived through, I've come to believe the Keep isn't about protection at all. It's about containment. I wasn't the kind of man who rattled easily. I knew the forest in every season, the way the trail dust tasted when summer dried it out, the whiskery smell of deer when they passed close, the sound of branches cracking under a cougar's slow, deliberate weight. There's a rhythm to the wilderness, a pulse you learn to read like a second heartbeat. I trusted that rhythm more than I trusted most people. It kept me sane. It kept me alive. But there were times, small, isolated moments, when something in that rhythm broke. At first, I ignored them. Every ranger does. A thump against my cabin door when no wind was blowing. Tracks in the frost that led toward the ridge but not away from it. The sensation of being watched long after a patrol should have settled my nerves. Nothing outrageous enough to report. Nothing I could put into words without sounding like I was losing sleep. I'd go home, scrub my hands under hot water, and convince myself it was all in my head. A man can lie to himself for years if the truth is big enough. The truth became impossible to avoid one night in late September. The season had changed early. Autumn swept down from the mountains like a warning, filling the forest with that sharp, mineral cold that smells almost metallic. I had been assigned a late shift, checking the northern boundary after a group of hikers reported hearing strange calls echoing near the old mining trail. They described it as something big, but not quite an animal. I laughed it off. People are always hearing things in the woods, but protocol said I needed to look. The sun had dipped behind the ridge, turning the sky into a gray-blue bruise. I parked the truck near the trailhead and stepped out into the thinning light. The air felt wrong. Not dangerous yet, just wrong. Too still. The kind of stillness that makes your footsteps sound like they're interrupting something you shouldn't hear. About a mile in, I found the first sign. A broken pine, snapped at the middle. Not fallen, snapped. The break was nearly 6 feet off the ground, the wood inside splintered but untouched by rot. Something strong had done it recently. Very strong. But there were no claw marks, no sign of machinery, no lightning burns. Just that clean, brutal break. I tried to reason it out. Maybe another tree fell on it. Maybe someone was messing around with a chainsaw. Maybe snow load had weakened it earlier in the year. The explanation sounded hollow even as I thought them. Another 100 yards, and I heard it. A sound like a man clearing his throat, except stretched, deepened, drawn through something enormous. It came from somewhere ahead, rising and falling in a pattern that made the hairs on my arms lift. I'd heard mountain lions, bears, elk in rut, coyotes mimicking human voices. Nothing in my experience scraped at my instincts the way that sound did. It wasn't the noise itself. It was the intent behind it. Like something announcing it knew I was there. I felt a pressure behind my ribs, the first whisper of fear. I should have turned back. A good ranger would have logged the sound, marked the location, returned with another officer at dawn. But something in me, the part that still believed the forest couldn't hold anything truly unnatural, made me keep going. At 2 miles in, the temperature dropped so sharply my breath fogged. I zipped my jacket. The cold had a thickness to it, like stepping into a different season. And that's when I saw the prints. They weren't fresh, but they were clear, indented into the damp earth near the trail, too long for a man, too narrow for a bear. The heel impression was deep enough to suggest weight that didn't make sense. And the gait, it wasn't quite right. Each step landed unevenly, as if whatever made them favored one side or had legs built for a different rhythm. I crouched, touched the soil. The dirt was colder inside the print than the ground around it. That was the moment my denial cracked. I stood slowly, every instinct telling me the forest had grown darker, even though the sky hadn't changed. My flashlight flickered twice when I turned it on, then steadied. The beam caught the edges of the prints, leading off the trail and into thicker brush. I didn't follow them. I was done pretending I had control. I radioed dispatch, kept my voice steady, told them I'd found unusual sign and was heading back. The words felt too calm, too practiced, but the forest didn't care how I sounded. It pressed in around me with that heavy silence again, like it was waiting for me to slip. I didn't notice the figure until I was nearly 50 yards from my truck. It was standing between the trees, just past the trail. A silhouette, tall, wrong in shape, too broad at the shoulders, and narrowing too sharply at the waist. Its outline shivered slightly, not from cold, but from movement that was too subtle for the eye to lock onto. My flashlight shook in my hand. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see eyes. But I felt them. Felt them the way you feel heat from a fire you aren't close to. Except this wasn't heat. It was scrutiny, a weight settling on my spine. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, from somewhere above me, a pine cone dropped onto the trail. Not fell. Dropped. Deliberate. The figure shifted, not toward me, downward, as if lowering its head. I broke. My boots hammered the dirt as I ran, every breath clawing at my throat. Branches slapped my arms, my neck, leaving thin, burning scratches. I didn't look back. Couldn't. My body had taken over, and it wanted nothing but the truck, the door, the engine, the road. When I reached the clearing, the forest felt quieter. Too quiet. I fumbled the keys, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the wheel to steady them before starting the engine. The headlights lit the trailhead. Empty. Still. Ordinary. I told myself I had imagined the figure, that the cold and the prints and the sound had gotten to me. But as I put the truck in gear, the radio crackled. Static at first, then a voice I didn't recognize. Not dispatch, not any ranger, just one word, distorted and low. Stay. I drove until the signal died, and that was only the beginning. For the next 2 days, I kept the radio incident to myself. I logged the broken tree and the prints in the most clinical terms I could manage, phrasing everything so carefully it was practically sterilized. I didn't mention the figure. I didn't mention the voice. I told myself I was being responsible, that I needed to gather my thoughts before reporting anything that might trigger an unnecessary response from the agency. That was the lie I fed myself. The truth was simpler. I didn't trust my own mind. I'd always believed fear was just a chemical reaction, something you could outthink, outwalk, or simply refuse to feed. But after that night on the trail, fear didn't feel like a reaction. It felt like a presence, a wet layer between me and the world, muting some sounds while amplifying others until the smallest noise twisted into meaning. I noticed it first in the cabin. I'd sit at the table trying to fill out my daily patrol forms, and my eyes would keep drifting toward the window. There was no reason to. The trees swayed normally. The shadows were the same ones I'd grown up with, but each time the wind pushed the branches apart, I half expected to see that silhouette standing there, head bowed again as if studying me. When I lay down at night, the silence pressed against my ears like I was underwater. My pulse felt too loud. My breathing felt borrowed. And somewhere under all of that, just faint enough that I couldn't blame the wind or the pipes, I began to hear it. A tap. Not a knock, a tap. Gentle, like someone trying to see if I was awake. It always came once, never twice, never repeated. Just a single, delicate tap somewhere on the wall or window, so soft I wasn't sure if it was real or if my mind had started stitching fear into the edges of my perception. By the third night, I found myself walking the perimeter of my cabin at 2 a.m. with a flashlight, pretending I was checking for wildlife activity. The ground was quiet. The boards were undisturbed. The trees whispered with the wind, innocent as ever. Nothing there. Nothing to point to. Nothing that explained the tap I was now waiting for, like a man listening for footsteps in his own attic. I told myself to sleep, to rest, to be rational. But the forest inside my mind was louder than the one outside. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the moment that pine cone dropped onto the trail. The timing had been too precise, too conscious, and the figure lowering its head as if acknowledging me. Acknowledging. That word gnawed at me. There's a unique terror in feeling seen by something that should not care whether you exist. By the 4th day, I decided to go back to the northern boundary. I told myself I needed to verify the prints again, see if weather had eroded them, maybe convince myself they had been misinterpreted. But deep down, I knew I was going back because I couldn't stand the uncertainty. I needed proof, either that something was there or that I had finally cracked. The latter scared me more. It was late afternoon when I hiked in. The sky was clouded over, the air thick with the damp smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. My boots pressed into the mud with slow, deliberate steps. The forest looked normal. Completely normal. And that normalcy carved a hollow ache under my ribs, the kind that comes from wanting something to make sense and knowing it won't. The prints were gone, not weathered, gone. The soil where they'd been was untouched, smooth like no one had passed through at all. Even the shift in soil temperature I remembered touching, that impossible cold, felt like a memory I wasn't sure I hadn't invented. I crouched where they had been, fingers in the earth, waiting for a trace of that cold. But the dirt was just dirt. That's when the doubt turned inward. I whispered to myself, "Did I imagine it?" The forest swallowed the words. I heard my breathing falter, felt the shake in my hands. It was the first time I'd questioned my own senses in all my years out here. And the moment that question formed, something inside my chest tightened, like the forest had looped a cord around my heart. I stood up too quickly, the world tilting for a second. Then I heard something behind me. A crunch, not loud, but deliberate. A single footstep in the brush, too heavy for a deer, too slow for a bear. I turned instantly, flashlight beam cutting through the undergrowth. Nothing, but the air felt wrong again, that same density from before. Cold sinking into my clothes without touching my skin. I scanned the trees, every muscle in my shoulders and neck pulled tight. Another step echoed behind me, but when I swung the light around, there was still nothing. My pulse pounded so hard it felt like it might bruise my ribs from the inside. "Stop," I whispered to myself. "Get it together." But the footsteps didn't stop. They began circling me, slow and wide, staying just at the edge of my hearing. The pattern was unmistakable, intentional, measuring the distance between us, not approaching, not retreating, just circling. My throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. I didn't want to turn my back, didn't want to see something the mind isn't meant to register, didn't want to know whether the figure I saw days earlier was still here, tracking me through the trees with that silent, predatory patience. When the circling finally stopped, the silence that followed felt like a verdict. The forest watched me, not the trees, not the animals, the forest and whatever was inside it. I forced myself to stand upright, lock my jaw, and breathe slowly. I wouldn't give in to panic. I couldn't, because if I did, if I let fear take the reins, I knew with a terrifying certainty that I would not make it back out. So I walked. Not quickly, not slowly, just steady, my steps landing with the rhythm of someone trying to convince the world they weren't being hunted. My flashlight flickered twice, the beam weakening. The battery was new. I'd replaced it the morning of the patrol. Another detail that pushed doubt deeper into my bones. The trees thinned ahead, revealing the faint line of the trail. And that's when I saw it. Not the figure. Not movement. A shape on the ground. At first, my brain refused to interpret it as anything but a pile of leaves disturbed by wind. But when I stepped closer, my breath caught. It was my radio. The one I'd been using that night on the trail. The one that had whispered stay. I hadn't dropped it. I hadn't lost it. I had left it on my cabin table 4 miles away. Yet here it was, half buried in needles, speaker cracked down the middle like something had pressed its weight onto it. My initials were still carved faintly into the back. I knelt, unable to breathe for a moment. Touching it felt like reaching into a version of myself I no longer trusted. My fingers hovered an inch above the plastic, and I hesitated. Not out of fear of the object, but out of fear that touching it would confirm this wasn't a hallucination. Because if it was real, then something had been inside my cabin, inside my home, inside the walls where I had tried to convince myself I was safe. My throat constricted. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was standing in a place I had no right to be. The radio crackled. No power, no light, but it crackled. And through that broken static, something breathed. Not words, breath. Slow, drawn out, intentional. Listening, waiting. That sound reached inside me and pulled something loose. Some deeply buried thread of instinct that whispered a truth I didn't want. This wasn't the forest losing its rhythm. This was something learning mine. I closed my hand around the radio and forced myself to move. My legs felt numb, but they carried me back down the trail, each step driven by a fear I didn't have names for yet. The sky was darkening fast, shadows stretching like long fingers across the path. I didn't look behind me. I couldn't. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I nearly collapsed with relief. But even as I climbed inside, hands trembling, breath unsteady, one thought pressed in me like a weight I couldn't shake. Whatever was watching me, it didn't fear me. It understood me. And that was far worse. I didn't drive straight back to my cabin. I should have. Every part of me wanted to. But something inside me, some shrinking, survival-driven voice, refused. The idea of returning to the place where the radio had been taken and brought back into the woods felt like willingly stepping into a snare. Instead, I drove to the ranger station. The building was dark except for the emergency lights in the hallways. I didn't turn on the main overheads. I didn't want anyone to see my face, even if no one else was around. I didn't want to see my face. I sat on the floor just inside the doorway, back against the wall, my fingers gripping the cracked radio so tightly my knuckles looked bleached. I tried to slow my breathing, but my lungs kept dragging in short, clipped gasps like they'd forgotten how expansion worked. The station should have felt like safety. Concrete walls, steel doors, fluorescent lights humming overhead. But I felt no safer than I had in the woods. If anything, the station made my fear stand out in sharper relief, as if the silence here wasn't natural, but waiting. I stared at the radio in my hands. The crack down the middle looked deliberate, almost symmetrical. I don't know why, but that symmetry bothered me more than the break itself. Animals don't do symmetrical damage. Weather doesn't either. Even humans rarely break things so precisely. I tried to open the back panel. My fingers wouldn't cooperate. They twitched uncontrollably. I had to clench them into fists just to feel like they belonged to me. I knew I needed to tell someone. A senior officer, a supervisor, anybody. But the words wouldn't form cleanly in my head. Every explanation sounded like a man unraveling, a man hallucinating, a man losing the ability to separate the world outside from the one decaying inside him. And that terrified me more than anything I'd seen on the trail. Because if my sense of reality was slipping, what else could I trust? What part of my own mind hadn't been infiltrated yet? Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and my entire body locked before I realized they were my own. I had stood without intending to. I just got up and started walking, like some part of me believed movement was safer than stillness. I stepped into the locker room. The familiar smell of pine disinfectant and wet nylon hit me, normally comforting, but now sharp enough to sting my nose. I splashed water on my face, gripping the sink until my hands steadied. When I lifted my head, my reflection startled me. I didn't look frightened. I looked expectant, as if I already knew something was coming. That expression sent a cold crawl down my spine. I leaned closer, studying my eyes, the tension around my mouth. I didn't look like myself. I looked like a man trying to pretend he wasn't afraid while every muscle betrayed the lie. I rested my forehead against the mirror. "You're losing it," I whispered. The lights flickered. Just once, but enough that the room shifted in tone, enough that my reflection briefly looked like a stranger leaning toward me, whispering the same words. I stumbled back so quickly I hit the bench behind me. The clatter echoed through the locker room like a warning. I grabbed the radio, shoved it into my jacket, and left the building. Outside, the forest looked darker than it should have. The sky was cloud-covered, but there was still a faint silver glow behind the tree line. Except here, standing in front of the station, the trees looked like a wall, a black, silent wall. I took a long breath, steadying myself. Then I heard something distinct, a whistle, not a bird call, not wind, but a low, rising whistle that sounded almost human, drifting from somewhere just beyond the perimeter fence. A memory struck me hard, one I hadn't thought of in years. When I was a kid, my father used to warn me about going too far into the ravines behind our property. If you hear a whistle that isn't a tune, he'd say, "Come back inside. Don't look. Don't answer. Just come back." At the time, I thought it was a mountain lion imitation or some tall tale to keep me close to home. But hearing that whistle now, soft and wavering, my father's words slammed into me with a force that made my stomach twist. I got in my truck and locked the doors. The whistle stopped. The silence afterward felt too abrupt, as if something had been waiting for my reaction. I drove back to the cabin at last, the headlights cutting through mist that hadn't been there earlier. The mist moved strangely, swaying in slow, deliberate waves like breath exhaled from something too large to see. My cabin stood where it always had, a square silhouette against the wall of trees, porch lights still glowing. But approaching it felt like approaching a place I'd already left behind, like turning the key would confirm something irreversible had happened here while I was away. Inside, the air smelled different, colder, damp, and faintly metallic. I froze immediately. I hadn't left any windows open. The wood stove had been cold for 2 days, but the cabin felt occupied. Not recently, but deeply, as if something had been walking through it long before I arrived. I swept the flashlight beam across the room. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. The table, the chair, the mugs by the sink. Except the door to the bedroom was open. I never leave it open. My stomach hollowed, but I stepped toward it anyway, drawn by the same mixture of dread and compulsion that had pulled me back to the northern trail. The shadows in the bedroom were long and soft, cushioned by the clouded moonlight coming through the window. My bed looked untouched. Then my eyes caught something on the pillow. A single pine needle. Just one. No others on the floor, none on the blankets. Just one needle, placed carefully in the center of the pillow, like a signature. A tremor rolled through me so violently I had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. Something had been here. Not just inside the cabin, in my room, at my bed. I reached for the flashlight with my other hand, and it rolled slightly in my grip. A faint tap echoed in the silent room as its plastic casing touched the wood. That tiny sound fractured my composure, because it was the same sound I'd been hearing at night, the same tapping I had tried to tell myself was in my head. And now it wasn't in my head. It was real. It had always been real. A pressure built behind my eyes like my mind was swelling against the inside of my skull, trying to push out the truth and the fear in equal measure. I backed out of the bedroom, closed the door gently, and sat on the floor of the main room. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat there, feeling the cabin breathe around me, feeling the walls settle, feeling the cold drift through the cracks in the logs like fingers searching for a pulse. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under. Not sleep, more like a blackout, a surrender. When I woke, it was still dark, but a faint grayness pressed against the windows. Early dawn, the hour when the world is too quiet and everything feels unfinished. My first instinct was to check the bedroom. The pine needle was gone, not blown away, not fallen, gone. The pillow was smooth, undisturbed. I stood there, staring at the empty fabric, and something inside me crumbled, not out of fear, but out of the sickening realization that I could no longer trust what remained or what vanished. I stepped back into the main room and froze. The radio was on the table, not in my jacket, not cracked, not damaged at all. It looked exactly as it had before the night everything changed. My jacket lay over the chair, empty. I reached out, hesitating just inches from the radio, my mind caught between two equally terrifying possibilities. Either I had misplaced it, or something had brought it back. I touched it. The radio was warm like someone had been holding it, warm like breath. A soft hiss came through the speaker. Then, a whisper, "Look behind you." I didn't. I couldn't. Every muscle in my body locked as if the command had bypassed my mind entirely and gone straight into my nerves. The whisper lingered in the room, fading slowly like something satisfied with my stillness. Minutes passed before I could breathe again. Even more before I could turn. But when I did, the cabin was empty. Completely empty. Except the front door was unlocked. I know I locked it. I know it. The cold inside me shifted into something sharper, something that cut deeper than fear. An understanding that whatever was happening wasn't just watching me from the woods anymore. It was following me home. And it knew how to get inside. The wind dropped the moment I stepped out of the tree line, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I could still hear the distant clatter of branches far behind me, the quiet echo of something moving through the undergrowth. Too heavy to be a deer. Too deliberate to be the wind. The sky above the ridge had gone from a pale winter blue to that washed-out gray that always seemed to show up right before snowfall. But there was no cold bite to the air yet. Just stillness. Just that waiting feeling. I tightened the strap of my radio against my shoulder and kept walking toward the clearing, telling myself that the open space would help me think, help me breathe. But even as the trees thinned and the world opened around me, the sense of being followed didn't ease. It had been there since morning, starting as a vague awareness, a prickling at the base of my neck, then slowly sharpening into something that felt almost intelligent, observant. The kind of feeling you get when someone watches you from behind a cracked door. I knew better than to jump at shadows. Years of ranger work had burned that out of me. You think you're hearing whispers in the branches? Probably just squirrels. Think you're being stalked? Most likely a raccoon. Think you saw a figure in the trees? More often than not, it's the silhouette of a trunk caught at the wrong angle. Imagination fills the void pretty quickly out here. But today wasn't imagination. The clearing stretched out before me, scattered with pine needles and patches of brown grass. Old fire scars marked the ground, circular burns from campfires long since extinguished. This place used to be a small backcountry campsite before they closed it down last summer. Too many incidents, too many missing hikers. Nothing was ever pinned on anything specific, but those of us who worked out here noticed the pattern long before the paperwork caught up. People who camped here alone usually didn't stay alone. Something always came for them. I crouched near the remnants of the old fire pit, running my fingers through the ash. Cold. No one's been here in weeks, maybe months, but the footprints around the perimeter told a different story. Human. Fresh. Less than 24 hours. My jaw tightened. Dispatch sent me out here to investigate a single abandoned tent reported by a hiker on the ridge, not footprints, not evidence of recent activity. A tent can be weeks old, but these prints were deep and carefully placed, as if whoever made them was trying not to be noticed. They curved toward the west side of the meadow and then vanished entirely as soon as they reached the tree line. No disturbance in the pine needles, no broken twigs, no soil displacement, just gone. I stood up slowly, scanning the forest. Nothing moved, not even a bird. It was unnatural, like the whole forest was pinned under a glass bowl. Ranger 5 reporting in, I said into my radio, forcing my voice steady. I've reached the old campsite. Signs of fresh human prints heading west. No sight of the missing hiker or tent yet. Static crackled back, then silence. I pressed the button again. Dispatch, do you copy? Nothing. I held the radio up, turning in a slow circle to check the signal. It should have worked here. I knew this clearing like I knew my own kitchen. The ridge to the east always bounced a clear channel, but today it felt like something was swallowing the frequencies, dragging them down into the cold earth. Of course, I muttered, lowering it. Of all days. A branch snapped somewhere behind me. Not subtle, not distant. Close. I turned, pulse quickening, but nothing shifted between the trees. No movement, just that heavy, patient silence. I moved forward, slow, deliberate steps, scanning left to right the way they taught us during training. Keep your breathing steady. Control the adrenaline. Don't let your mind fill in the blanks. But today, the blanks filled themselves. About 30 feet into the trees, I found another print. Just one. Perfectly placed in a patch of soft earth between pine roots. Deep enough to show the heel, but the toe angled upwards slightly. Like the person had been poised, mid-step, listening for something. The forest dimmed around me. Clouds thickened overhead. I knelt to examine the footprint, brushing away loose debris. Same boot tread as the ones in the clearing. Same depth. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. Something about its placement, the way the forest floor around it was untouched, how the footprint looked pressed into soil that hadn't been disturbed in days. Footprints don't appear alone, and they damn sure don't appear without approach prints. A cold wave slipped through me, washing up my spine, making my breath fog in front of my face, even though the air wasn't cold enough for that. I reached out to touch the impression again. The ground hummed beneath my fingertips. Just for a second. Soft, faint. Like a pulse. I pulled my hand back and rose to my feet. Another branch cracked, this time to my right, then another to my left. Something was circling. The sound wasn't wild, frantic, or animalistic. It was methodical, choosing where to step, choosing where to stay silent. "Who's out there?" I called. No answer. My instincts screamed to back up toward the clearing, but the forest floor behind me rustled lightly. The kind of sound someone makes when shifting their weight very slowly on dry needles, cutting off escape. Not good. I forced my voice louder. If you're hurt, I can help you. Still nothing. The wind began to move again, but only in the upper branches, too high to feel. It stirred the canopy with a low moaning sound, like distant voices overlapping. Something about the sound pressed on my chest. Heavy, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. I stepped backward, inch by inch, careful not to trip on roots. My hand hovered near my sidearm. I didn't want to draw it unless I had to. Out here, putting your hand on a weapon usually meant one of two things. You either meant to use it, or you were scared enough that the forest could smell it on you. The rustling behind me stopped. The forest went dead silent again. Then, from somewhere deep among the trees, a voice called out. But it wasn't a human voice. It mimicked one. A single word, stretched too long, too smooth around the edges, like someone was trying to learn speech by hearing it only once. Ranger! My blood went cold. That voice didn't belong to any person alive. It felt like it came from the trees themselves, from the cold soil, from everything that had seen and swallowed the people who vanished here. I didn't answer. I didn't breathe. The voice called again, closer this time. Ranger! I took one step back, then another, and something stepped forward to match me, perfectly synchronized, hidden just beyond the dark line of trunks. Not rushing, not threatening, just matching. Like it wanted me to know how close it was. The fear didn't hit all at once. It came slow, settling into my bones, making the air thin around my mouth. Every instinct I had screamed to run, but something deeper, something older, told me not to. Running felt like the exact thing that voice wanted from me. So I stood still. The footsteps in the trees stopped, and then the forest whispered, barely audible, like leaves brushing together even though none were moving. Turn around. I didn't. But I felt it behind me anyway. Tall. Wrongly tall. Leaning forward just slightly. Close enough that the cold radiating off it touched the back of my neck like a shadow made of ice. I kept my voice steady, barely. What do you want? The answer came in a low, threaded whisper. You came looking. And then, with a tone that sounded almost amused, so look. I turned. And what I saw standing in the half-light of the clearing tore the breath from my lungs and left me with the sickening certainty that I just crossed a line I wasn't meant to cross. I turned before I could stop myself. Some mix of instinct, command, and a pressure behind my ribs that felt less like fear and more like something pushing me, urging me to look. Like whatever stood there had already reached into my thoughts and curled its fingers around the decision before I made it. And when my eyes landed on the figure in the clearing, my mind didn't register terror first. It registered wrongness. Tall. Too tall for a human frame. Its silhouette stretched up past the height of any person I'd ever encountered out here, its shoulders sloping slightly, as if its body had been constructed from an idea of a human rather than the reality of one. The edges of it were blurred, not like motion blur, but like heat haze, waves of distortion trembling around arms and legs that didn't move. Its face, God. Its face was the worst part. It wasn't featureless. That would have been easier. It had features, just not all at once. As I stared, its eyes shifted location, sliding from too high on its skull to too low, settling near the center before drifting again like they were trying to find the correct spot. A mouth formed and unformed, stretching too wide, then too narrow, like soft clay being pushed and molded by invisible hands. But the thing that hit me hardest was the expression. It was trying to smile, and failing. The attempt created a twisted shape that looked almost mournful, almost amused, almost curious, cycling through emotions it had seen but never felt. My legs locked. My breath caught halfway up my throat, and the silence stretched so thin around us I could hear my heartbeat pounding inside my ears. The thing tilted its head. Not a human tilt, not a question. More like it was adjusting the angle of my reflection, and then with a slow ripple across its body, it took one step toward me. But the moment its foot touched the ground, the world around us changed. I don't mean the trees bent or the sky darkened or anything dramatic. It was smaller than that. More subtle. The sound of the forest came back, but wrong. The wind shifted through the branches, but instead of its natural rhythm, it moved in perfect intervals, like breathing. The leaves rustled in patterns, repeating patterns. Something in those sounds wasn't environmental at all. It was communication. The thing in front of me turned its head slightly as if listening. Then its mouth formed again, more coherent this time. The voice that came out wasn't the warped mimic I'd heard before. It was clearer now, more practiced. Ranger. It held the word for half a second too long, but the shape of it was better, closer to human. It pointed one long, distorted arm toward the trees behind it, not with a hand, because the hand hadn't fully formed, but with an intent, a direction, a pull. Something rustled where it gestured. I squinted into the shadows. At first, I saw nothing. Then the forest seemed to peel back, like something stepped forward out of the darkness instead of through it. And my stomach dropped. A tent. A blue one-man backpacker tent I recognized from the missing hiker report. The fabric was dirty, torn near the base, and sagging as if something had pulled the stakes free. It shouldn't have been here. Dispatch said it was farther uphill, half a mile at least, but there it was. And beside it, movement. I took a step forward before I realized I'd moved at all. A man sat next to the tent, early 30s, dark hair, tan jacket, the exact description from the report. His head hung low, chin pressed against his chest. One hand rested limp across his knee. Relief hit me first. Sharp, bright, human relief. "Sir!" I shouted, raising my voice. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to help you." I took a second step, and the man's head snapped upward, not lifted. Snapped. His face tilted too quickly, too rigidly, like his neck had no muscle resistance. His eyes met mine, wide and unblinking, dilated so far the irises were barely visible. His mouth moved silently at first, opening and closing like he was struggling to remember how to shape a word. Then, with a brittle, broken rhythm, "Don't. Come. Closer." The words came out in a desperate whisper. Not fearful. Warning. I froze mid-stride. The tall figure in front of me shifted again, its body twitching slightly, the way a radio signal jumps when interference cuts across it. The air around it shimmered. The hiker's breathing turned ragged, chest rising and falling too quickly, like he was fighting something unseen. He glanced toward the tall figure, and then his hand shot out, not toward me, but toward the dirt beside him, his fingers curled into the soil, scraping desperately as if he was trying to hold himself in place. "Please," he whispered, "don't look at it." My throat tightened. I already did. His face twisted with a pain I didn't understand. His eyes filled with something close to pity. "You shouldn't have." Behind him, the forest shuddered. Not the trees, the shadows. They shifted, bending, flattening, that stretching as if multiple shapes were moving through them at once. Low murmurs drifted through the air, soft, layered voices echoing over one another like a broken choir. Slowly, the tall figure in front of me raised its head higher, then higher still. Its distorted smile widened, and I realized with a sickening clarity that hit me harder than any horror before it. It wasn't alone. The shadows behind the missing hiker began to step forward, one by one. Tall, wrong, watching, waiting. The hiker's breath hitched, and he whispered with the last bit of strength he seemed to have, "They want you to find them." He looked up at me with hollow, pleading eyes. "Don't let them take you too." Then something grabbed him. Not a hand, not a visible shape, just a violent jerk, like an invisible hook had snagged his spine and ripped backward. His body slid across the ground, dragged into the shadows so fast the air displaced in a burst of dust. Gone. The tall figure turned back toward me, and the world tilted slightly as if reality itself was shifting to make room for whatever it was. Then, quietly, calmly, almost gently, it extended a hand toward me and whispered, "Your turn." I didn't run. I wish I could tell you I did. That instinct took over, that training kicked in, that some primal part of me ripped control from everything else and shoved my legs into motion. But that didn't happen. Instead, something inside me tightened, like a hand closing around the center of my chest, holding me still. Not paralyzed, just claimed. The tall figure's hand remained extended, and the forest around us went unnaturally still. Even the wind seemed to stop halfway through a breath. I felt the absence of movement more than the presence of anything else, like the world was waiting to see whether I'd accept what was being offered. Its fingers shifted, clarifying a little more, as if reality was slowly giving in to its shape. The hesitation in its body, the blur around the edges, the pulsing distortion, it all seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I didn't understand the connection, but I felt it. Then something inside me broke. A snap, not physical, but visceral, like a string tied to a deeper part of my mind had been cut. The sound wasn't external, it was internal. A sudden rush of sensation flooded me, fear, confusion, memory, instinct colliding all at once, and beneath it all, a deeper, older dread that didn't feel like mine. I stumbled back. The figure stepped forward. The temperature dropped so sharply it tasted metallic on my tongue. The breath that left my mouth fogged instantly, twisting upward like smoke. My vision sharpened unnaturally, every detail painfully clear. Bark texture, frost forming on the ground, the small trembling ripple of air around the creature. Then I heard the whisper, not external, inside. A subtle shift beneath my thoughts, like a thread slipping between them. Come. I clamped my jaw shut, forcing a breath. My hand hovered instinctively near my radio, but I knew before I touched it nothing in that device would help me. You don't call dispatch when the forest stops behaving like the outdoors and starts behaving like a consciousness. I took another step back, and my heel struck something soft. I turned, and the world dropped out from under me. It wasn't the forest floor behind me. It wasn't even a clearing anymore. It looked like the forest, but wrong, doubled, like a reflection in darkened glass. The trees were in the same place, but their dimensions were stretched, elongated, warped, shadows hung at impossible angles. The air felt thick, almost viscous, and every sound echoed with a faint, delayed distortion. I'd stepped into something, or something had stepped around me. The tall figure didn't follow, not exactly. Instead, its shape flickered, as though the space between us wasn't a distance but a transition. One moment it was 10 feet away, the next, 5, then 3, without moving. I scrambled back, boots slipping in the thickening layer of frost forming underfoot. And then behind me, a voice whispered my name. Not just any voice, a voice I knew. A voice I hadn't heard in years. My father's. I spun so fast I nearly lost my footing. The forest behind me shifted again, the warped trees rearranging themselves like the path was being rewritten. A shape stood between two trunks, half shadowed, half visible. Broad shoulders. The same worn jacket I remembered. The same way he held his hands, one relaxed, the other slightly curled as if still holding a tool he'd put down years ago. My lungs collapsed inward. Dad? The shape stepped closer. My mind screamed no, 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 but my chest screamed yes with a desperation I'd never felt. The ache of grief collided with the terror already clawing through me. And suddenly I wasn't standing in a clearing anymore. I was standing in an old memory twisted into a nightmare. His voice, my father's voice, slipped through the cold air like a thread pulling at the softest part of me. It's all right. Come here. Every instinct I had screamed that it wasn't him. Every wound in me begged to believe it was. I took a half step forward before I realized what I was doing. The tall figure behind me made a soft, whispering hum, like approval, like encouragement, like it wanted me to move toward the thing wearing the shape of my father. The figure in the trees tilted its head at an angle my father never could have. The movement was wrong, smooth, too clean, like a puppet's motion. Its smile stretched just a little too wide, and all at once the grief inside me twisted, not softened, weaponized. That's when I understood what this thing was doing. It wasn't showing me monsters, it was showing me my weaknesses, my openings, places inside me where I was fractured, hurt, vulnerable. It was using memories like bait, stitching familiar voices into its fabric to pull me where it wanted. And what scared me more than anything wasn't what stood before me. It was how close I'd come to stepping forward. The figure in the trees lifted one hand, my father's hand, except it wasn't. The skin shimmered, rippling like water, the texture too smooth, too reflective, as if it was trying to maintain the illusion, but struggling to keep the details intact. I watched its fingers lengthen slightly, then retract, then lengthen again as though trying to settle on the right proportions. It wasn't wearing his face. It was wearing my memory of him. And the moment I realized that, something inside me hardened. The tall figure behind me hissed, low, irritated, almost disappointed. The air vibrated with a sudden pressure, like the atmosphere grew heavy with its intent. The fake father took a step forward. I took a step back. The tall figure flickered closer. Then the forest, real forest, not the warped one, broke through my vision for a split second. A brief, fleeting moment of clarity, a tear in the illusion. Fight. It wasn't a whisper from the creature. It was mine, my voice, my instinct, my will. I took a deep breath, clenched my teeth, and forced myself to look away from the figure wearing my father's shape. The thing snarled. A glitch, a snap, a tear in the sound, its voice distorting into something harsh and inhuman. The tall figure's form rippled violently, and all at once, the entire forest around me lurched, not from motion, from rejection. I stumbled forward, falling back into the real clearing, like the warped world had spat me out. The temperature shifted back to normal. The shadows stopped bending. The tall figure now stood directly in front of me. No illusions. No masks, just its shifting, wrong, impossible face. It leaned close, its whisper brushing the inside of my skull. You resist. The voice wasn't angry. It was curious, observing, studying, almost delighted. Then it leaned even closer until I felt its breath, or something like breath, drag across my cheek. Good. The world around us trembled, and in a single motion that stole every ounce of heat from the air, it lifted one long, distorted finger and pointed behind me. I didn't want to turn. I didn't want to see what came next, but I did. And when I saw what the forest had become, when I saw what had stepped out from the trees, when I saw what had been waiting for me newly exposed, my knees nearly buckled. Because it wasn't a twisted memory, and it wasn't a mimic. It was something real, something ancient, something that had been there long before I arrived. And it had finally decided to show itself. I turned, and the forest was no longer a forest. Not entirely. The trees were still there, towering pines, tight clusters of spruce, the same layered undergrowth, yet the space between them had changed. The darkness had volume now, weight, depth, like the shadows had thickened into something physical, something capable of pressing against the edges of the clearing. And standing just beyond that threshold was the thing that made my stomach collapse inward. It wasn't shaped like a man. It wasn't shaped like anything I had a name for. Tall, taller than the first figure, at least 9, maybe 10 feet. But its height wasn't what terrified me. It was the stillness, the absolute suffocating lack of movement, like the creature wasn't bound by the rules of life or breath or gravity. Its skin, or what passed for skin, was coarse, pale, and rough like weathered stone. Not white, not gray, something in between, the color of a frostbitten landscape under a moonless sky. Its torso was broad, powerful, but wrong in its proportions. Shoulders too wide, arms too long, legs straight and rigid as if carved rather than grown, and its head, God. Its head was the part that sank into the deepest part of me and stayed there. Because it didn't have a face. Not in the way we think of faces, where features should have been, eyes, a nose, a mouth. There were indentations, shallow depressions, outlines of anatomy without the substance. Like a sculptor had started to form a face and abandoned it halfway through. But even without eyes, I felt it looking at me. My heartbeat stumbled hard against my ribs. A cold, dense pressure slid down my spine like a trickle of ice. The tall mimic beside me suddenly seemed small, insignificant, a follower, not a leader. Because whatever stood in front of me now, whatever ancient shape had stepped out of the forest, it didn't imitate anything. It didn't need to. It was origin, not echo. And when it inhaled a slow, deep, cavernous sound like air being drawn through a hollow mountain, the wind in the clearing shifted with it. Needles rustled in response, bending in the direction of its breath. It changed the environment simply by existing. My throat tightened, my instincts screamed. Turn, run, move. But I didn't move. because everything in me whispered the same terrifying truth. If I ran, it would follow. If I fought, it would tear me apart. If I spoke, it would hear more than my voice. It would hear my fear, my history, my memories, my weaknesses. So I stood there, locked somewhere between flight and collapse. The mimic beside me bowed its head slightly, a ripple of deference moving through its distorted frame, a servant acknowledging its master. The faceless creature responded with nothing more than a slow rotation of its head toward me. The indentations where eyes should have been aligned with my own gaze. I couldn't breathe. It didn't speak, not with words. It projected something into the air, a low-frequency hum so deep I felt it in the center of my chest rather than heard it in my ears. The vibration crawled through my ribcage, sank into my bones, and made my vision pulse. But beneath the vibration, something else formed, a sensation, a meaning. One word, not spoken, impressed, found. The clearing tightened around me. Something in the air grew heavy enough that my knees bent involuntarily, like the forest itself had bent gravity toward the creature. My breath came out in short, burning gasps, and then it took a step forward. The ground trembled, not violently, not enough to knock me off balance, but enough to communicate its presence through the earth itself. Pine needles lifted and fell in a wave around its feet. Frost crawled outward in thin branching tendrils, reaching toward me like fingers. I stumbled backward. The mimic hissed sharply and moved to block me. An unexpected gesture, defensive, almost possessive, as if guarding me from something far worse than itself. But the faceless figure didn't acknowledge it. It simply tilted its unfinished head the slightest degree and lifted one massive hand. Its fingers were long, thick, and knotted like roots. They opened slowly, deliberately, 1, 2, 3, until the palm faced the sky. Something changed in the air. A pull, not physical, not magnetic, but gravitational in a way that made my thoughts feel heavy, like the creature had reached inside the atmosphere and adjusted some unseen pressure. The mimic immediately backed away from me. Its body shivered with a ripple of distortion, as if reacting to commands I couldn't hear. The ground beneath it darkened. Its limbs twitched, its form thinned at the edges, and then it kneeled. A creature that had just manipulated my memories knelt. To this thing. My mouth went dry, my ears rang. Whatever hierarchy I'd imagined before was wrong. This wasn't the top of a chain, it was the bottom of a vertical drop. And the creature before me wasn't some forest legend or misidentified animal, it was a presence, an entity, something elemental. Something that didn't mimic humans because it had never needed to. It created the things that mimicked. And it stepped closer. The trees bent slightly toward it, as if drawn by a force older than wind. When it reached the place where the missing hiker had sat minutes earlier, it paused, not out of hesitation, but as if examining the memory I had of standing there. A faint electrostatic crackle spread through the clearing. My hair rose at the back of my neck. Then, without warning, the creature moved faster than something that size should move. Sudden, silent, instant. It closed the remaining distance between us in the space of a heartbeat. I didn't scream. Couldn't. Its towering frame leaned down, bringing the smooth, unfinished surface where its face should have been inches from mine. I felt its breath, or the pressure of its existence, drag over my skin like a cold current. And in a soundless, wordless transmission that bypassed every sense I had and struck directly into the center of my mind, it asked me a question. Not in English, not in any human tongue. The meaning was pure, raw, undiluted. What did you see? The question shook something loose inside me, something buried deeper than the fear, deeper than the illusion, deeper than the grief from before. Because I knew what answer it expected. I knew what answer the mimic had tried to push me toward. It wanted me to say its world, its illusions, its bait, its masks. It wanted me to admit I had seen its power as truth, but I hadn't. Not fully. Not enough to surrender. I swallowed hard, fighting the crushing pressure in my lungs. I saw you, I whispered. The forest stopped breathing. Everything froze, and the creature stilled. Utterly, completely. Then its faceless head tilted, slow, precise, deliberate. A new meaning seeped into my bones colder than winter stone. Not approval, not anger, recognition. It lifted one immense hand and hovered it above my chest, not touching, just close enough that the heat of my body recoiled from its cold. Then it withdrew the hand and stepped back. The mimic trembled violently on the ground. The faceless figure turned, slowly, like a mountain shifting. And the second before it vanished into the shadow behind the trees, a final word carved itself into my mind, burned in like a brand. Not yet. Then it was gone. And the forest exhaled. Hard, fast, all at once. Sound returned, heat rushed back in, the trees straightened, the shadows thinned, the clearing reassembled itself like a room settling after an earthquake. The mimic rose slowly, its form still trembling, the distortion around its body flickering like a dying signal. For the first time since I'd seen it, it looked unsure. It didn't approach me. It didn't speak. It simply stared, with eyes that were finally fully formed. And in that moment, I understood something terrifying. It wasn't done with me, but whatever ruled it was waiting. The mimic's eyes, newly shaped, unsettlingly human, held mine for a long, unbearable moment. They didn't blink. They didn't shimmer. They didn't shift. For the first time, they were steady, anchored, as if the creature had finally decided on the version of reality it wanted to inhabit. And in those eyes, I didn't see hunger or mimicry or malice. I saw fear. It flinched when the last echo of the faceless creature faded into the forest, like the retreating presence left behind a vacuum, one the mimic wasn't prepared to fill. Its limbs jittered, the distortion around its edges rippling like heat radiating off asphalt. It wasn't glitching out of malice. It was glitching out of terror. Not of me, but of the thing that had just walked away. I took a slow step back, watching it carefully. My muscles trembled from the strain of holding everything inside myself tight for too long. The cold that creature left behind lingered in my bones, a hollow ache I could still taste in my breath. The mimic mirrored my step, one backward for mine, but delayed, like it wasn't imitating the motion itself, but the state of mind that caused it. Then, slowly, its newly formed mouth opened. The voice was smoother now, almost natural. I wasn't sure if that was progress or a warning. "Why did you kneel?" I asked, hearing the shake in my voice. The mimic tilted its head, considering my question. A long, drawn-out ripple moved down its arm, and then it spoke again, this time with more clarity. "Because it sees." "Sees what?" It shivered violently. A distortion rolled across its torso like a wave of static. "You." The word hit harder than any threat. Before I could respond, it lifted one arm and pointed to the tree line, toward the direction the faceless creature had disappeared. But this time, the gesture wasn't urging me to follow. It was warning me away. The mimic lowered its arm and seemed to shrink slightly, drawing in on itself. Its shape flickered, and for a moment it resembled the missing hiker again. Same frame, same trembling posture, same look of dread in the eyes. But then it shifted back, as if fighting the reflex. It wasn't just mimicking people. It was mimicking fear. My fear. The hiker's fear. Its own fear. And that realization made something awful settle into my stomach. Because if this creature capable of distorting reality, of wearing faces, of manipulating perception, was scared, what the hell did that make the faceless one? A branch snapped behind us. Both the mimic and I froze, not the faceless creature. The air hadn't thickened. The pressure hadn't changed. The cold hadn't returned. This was something else. Something normal. Something human. A flashlight beam cut between the trees, sharp, steady, controlled. Voices followed. 2, 3, then 4. Ranger voices. I recognized the cadence of one of them. Mason, a ranger from the neighboring district. Calm, experienced. Someone who'd spent enough nights in the woods to know the difference between a coyote cough and a human scream. The mimic stiffened, its form blurring again, not out of aggression but instinct. Survival. It backed up into the darker edge of the clearing, night, the distortion around its limbs growing thicker. More branches cracked. More lights appeared. "Miller!" Mason's voice rang out, my name echoing through the clearing. I swallowed, throat burning. I should have called out. I should have stepped forward. I should have run to them and collapsed with relief. But my body didn't move. The mimic was still too close. The cold from the faceless creature still lingered, and that thing's last words, "Not yet," still echoed in my chest like a bruise. I wasn't ready for this to be found. I wasn't ready for anyone else to be here. I wasn't ready for the consequences of being seen. The mimic turned its head toward the approaching lights. Its newly formed eyes narrowed, studying the glow the way an animal studies fire, fascinated, wary, uncertain. Then it turned back toward me. "Ranger," it whispered again, softer this time. Not a warning, not a threat. A strange, impossible attempt at reassurance or gratitude or connection. It took a single step backward, then another. Then it broke apart. Not violently, not painfully, more like its body dissolved into a fine haze of distortion, each particle catching the light like dust motes as they drifted toward the forest shadow. Then the haze bent inward, compressed, and vanished into the tree line without a sound. Mason's flashlight beam swept through the space where the mimic had stood a second before. Nothing. No footprints. No frost. No evidence. Just me, standing in a clearing filled with disturbed soil, broken branches, and the heavy imprint of a terror that hadn't left a mark the human eye could see. "Miller," Mason called out again, pushing through the underbrush with two other rangers behind him. "Holy hell, what happened?" I opened my mouth, closed it. The truth crawled up my throat like something alive, fighting to escape, but something deeper inside me, some survival instinct I didn't know I had, kicked in hard. "Not yet." I drew in a breath and steadied my voice. "Hiker," I managed. "He was here." Mason's eyes widened. "Where? Did you see him?" "Yes." Dragged into the shadows by something that wasn't supposed to exist. "No," I lied. "Just signs he'd been here. He ran." Mason didn't look convinced. He studied me the way rangers study injured wildlife. Carefully, respectfully, but preparing for the possibility the thing in front of them might bolt or bite. "You look pale," he said quietly. "You hurt?" "I'm fine." The lie tasted colder than the air. The other rangers spread out, scanning the tree line with their lights. Every beam passed the spot where the mimic had vanished. None of them paused. None of them saw anything they recognized as wrong. And I realized then, whatever I had stepped into, whatever had stepped into me, wasn't something normal eyes could track. "Miller?" Mason said, stepping closer. "You sure you're all right?" I nodded. But inside, my heart thrummed with a new, awful truth. I had been seen. Not in the human sense, in the primal sense, in the ancient sense. Seen by something that didn't observe the world. It curated it. The group stood in silence for a moment, listening for any trace of the missing hiker. A distant owl called. A breeze moved through the pines. The forest returned to its natural rhythm. But nothing, not one sound hinted at what had stood here minutes earlier. After a while, Mason exhaled. "All right, let's get you back to base. We'll regroup before dawn." I didn't argue. As we walked out of the clearing, I kept glancing over my shoulder, not because I expected the mimic, not because I feared the faceless one would return, but because a part of me, the same part that had recognized the danger too late, felt something lingering in the air, a presence, a promise, a continuation. And as the forest thinned and the first faint glow of ranger station lights cut through the darkness, a quiet realization slid into place with a weight that nearly buckled my knees. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. Something had chosen me, marked me, watched me. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, somewhere ancient and hidden and not meant for human eyes, the faceless creature had paused, turned, and recorded my presence. Waiting. Not yet had never meant no. It had meant soon. And God help me. I could feel the soon coming. I should have turned back the moment I realized the trail was breathing, not metaphorically, not some poetic exaggeration people lean on to make the wilderness sound mystical. I mean, the earth under my boots rose and fell, slow, steady, like the exhale of something buried just beneath the frost line. I felt it through the soles, through the bones of my ankles, a subtle lift and slump that didn't match the wind or the shifting of trees, a living rhythm. And I kept walking, because that's what rangers do. Pretend we know what the hell we're dealing with. My name is Nathan Cole. I've been a backcountry ranger for 13 years, long enough to lose friends to falls, exposure, hidden crevasses, human cruelty, long enough to know that most of the national forest doesn't give a damn about you, long enough to understand that when someone vanishes, nature doesn't always take the blame, but it takes the body, and long enough to know that the worst disappearances are the ones I still can't talk about without my throat tightening. 2 years ago, I lost a trainee, Elena March, 27, bright-eyed, annoyingly prepared for everything except the things she needed preparation for. She vanished on a routine patrol. We found her radio, her pack, a streak of something across snow that looked like drag marks until the wind filled them in. Nothing else. I was the last person to see her alive, and I've spent every waking hour since trying to reconstruct her final steps. That guilt is the only reason I accepted the new winter patrol route, Route 13, on the far edges of the forest. No one likes taking it. It's long and unmaintained, and half the markers are missing, and depending on who you ask, it's either cursed or just poorly planned. The route loops through old mining land and cuts near the abandoned radio facility the government swears they removed decades ago. Trails vanish there. So do animals. So does time. That last part, most people say is a joke. I don't. My first patrol on Route 13 began before dawn, a faint red glow on the horizon, cold enough that the air tasted metallic. My breath streamed in front of me in a thin, white column. The forest felt hollowed out, as if every bird and squirrel had climbed deeper into the earth to hide from something coming. The silence wasn't peaceful. It had weight. The kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums until you hear your own pulse. I signed in at the trailhead, radioed base, and stepped forward. The temperature dropped immediately. A sharp, sudden fall as if I'd crossed into a cold pocket. My eyelashes frosted before I'd gone 50 yards. I tried to rationalize it. Valley wind pattern, shade, pre-storm atmospheric shift. But logic doesn't help when your instincts are screaming that you've just entered something's territory. The first mile was uneventful. Snow-covered pines, old tracks from the previous week's patrol, the usual creaks and distant snaps of winter timber adjusting. But the deeper I went, the more wrong the forest began to feel. Trees stood too straight, too evenly spaced, like soldiers in formation. No brush, no undergrowth, just trunks rising from the snow, identical in width and color, their bark the same shade of ashy gray. And then the breathing started beneath my boots. At first I thought it was my imagination. Stress from being back here alone, but no. Once I stopped, I could see loose snow shifting in rhythmic pulses, dusting upward with each subtle expansion of the earth. I crouched, put my glove flat against the snow, felt a warmth radiating upward, faint but unmistakable. Something was alive beneath the surface. I didn't dig. God, no. You don't break ground when you don't know who or what is sharing it with you. Instead, I backed off the trail a few steps, listening. The forest inhaled, exhaled, inhaled, slow and steady like a sleeper dreaming. That was when I first heard the voice. Very soft, very distant, as though someone was whispering from under 20 feet of soil. Nathan? I froze. The sound came from directly below me, muffled, genderless, barely audible, but it knew my name. I stepped back fast, heart hammering, and the whisper followed like a tiny vibration through the soles of my boots. Nathan. My hand went to my radio, but the static hit immediately. Not static like interference or low reception. This was a metallic screech, sharp and layered, like dozens of voices screaming through a wire mesh. I killed the transmission and swallowed hard. I should have turned back. But Elena used this same route before she vanished. And every time I took this patrol, every time I traced her absence with my own steps, I felt closer to understanding what happened to her. So I kept moving. Another mile in, the breathing stopped. The ground stabilized, and for a moment I let myself think I'd imagined it all. I relaxed, even allowed a small exhale of relief until something brushed my ankle. Not snow, not wind, not a branch. A pressure, cold, intentional, like fingertips. I jerked back so fast I nearly lost my footing. My headlamp swung across the clearing, illuminating nothing but trees, no tracks, no prints, no movement, but the smell hit me. Burnt hair. Sharp, acrid, unmistakable, as if something had been singed nearby. The scent drifted in thick waves carried by no wind at all. I swept my light low, scanning for signs of fire. Nothing. Not even melted snow. Just the smell lingering like an invisible fog. My breathing quickened. My voice sounded too loud when I spoke. Anyone out there? The forest held its breath. No echo, no answer. But something shifted ahead, a flicker of movement behind a cluster of pines. Too fast to be wind, too smooth to be an animal. A silhouette gliding, its outline almost human. I stepped toward it. It stepped behind another tree. My throat tightened. It was following the rhythm of my movements. I took one step left. It shifted left. I ducked slightly. It ducked. But when I stopped, it didn't. It kept drifting. Not away, but closer, sliding with impossible grace between the trunks. Never fully visible, never stepping into the open, just edges, shoulders, limbs, a head tilted at an unnatural angle. I switched off my headlamp. Darkness swallowed me instantly. My eyes adjusted just enough to see the faint outline of the thing. Still moving, still shifting behind the trees, its silhouette darker than the rest of the night. Then it stopped and stood perfectly still. For a long, unnerving moment, I thought it was watching me. Then it raised one arm and pointed toward the old mining territory, a place no one is supposed to go. A place the Forest Service sealed decades ago after a collapse that killed 12 workers. A place Elena had been assigned to check the week she vanished. My stomach dropped. The air around me tightened like invisible hands clutching my ribs. Everything in me screamed to run the opposite direction. But dread has a way of pulling you forward when you least want it to. I turned my head for a fraction of a second, maybe to check the trail behind me, maybe to blink away tears I didn't realize had formed. When I looked back, the silhouette was gone. Completely. Not a branch swaying, not a shadow retreating, just absence. Even worse, the smell of burnt hair was gone too, replaced by something else. Wet fur. Rot, a thick, heavy odor rising from the direction it had pointed. The old mine. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, pulse thundering in my ears, and forced myself toward the scent, toward the abandoned tunnels, toward the cold black mouth of the forest's oldest secret. Because whatever was down there, it was calling me. And part of me, God help me, was ready to answer. The deeper I went toward the old mining grounds, the more the forest changed around me. The pines grew sparse, then twisted, then stopped entirely, as if the soil itself refused to nourish anything close to what lay ahead. The ground turned uneven, pitted with shallow depressions like footprints that didn't match any animal I knew, too wide, too smooth, too perfectly circular, as if something heavy had rested there just long enough to leave an impression and then moved on without walking. The smell thickened as I approached the mining zone. Wet fur and rot, but also something sharper beneath it. Sulfur, faint, but burning the back of my throat. I pulled my scarf up, breathing through fabric, though it didn't help much. The air itself felt tainted, like it carried memory, like every breath fed me someone else's panic. My flashlight beam caught the old perimeter fence, rusted, bent in places, half swallowed by snow drifts. The sign hung sideways on one nail, the words barely legible. Danger, unstable tunnels, keep out. Someone had clawed 3 deep gouges through the metal, scraping the paint clean. They weren't human marks. I've seen claw scars from bears, mountain lions, feral dogs, even deranged survivalists with knives. They don't look like that. These were long, straight, purposeful, like whatever had made them was testing the metal, seeing how deep it could cut. The smell grew overpowering. My breath came shallow and fast. The snow around the fence was disturbed, not fresh tracks, but churned earth beneath the drifts. Something had moved through here recently, something heavy. My radio crackled suddenly, making me flinch hard. Not static this time, breathing. Someone or something was breathing into the channel. Slow, deep, wet. I lifted the radio slowly to my ear. Hello, this is Ranger Cole. Identify yourself. The breathing paused. Then the voice came through. Not Elena's voice, not exactly, but close enough that my vision blurred for a moment. "Nathan, why didn't you come back for me?" I nearly dropped the radio. I forced myself to breathe, to stay rational. Auditory hallucinations were possible. Stress-induced mimicry of a familiar voice. Trauma playing tricks. But hallucinations don't respond to your reactions, because the voice changed as soon as my pulse spiked. It softened, sounded almost amused. "Still following the path, Nathan?" My hands shook. Sweat gathered under my gloves despite the freezing air. I turned off the radio again. No more voices, no more tricks. The mine entrance waited ahead, black against white snow, smelling like wet fur and sulfur and cold iron. The support beams around the opening looked freshly scraped, as if something had used them to pull itself inside. Or out. Every story about abandoned mines starts the same way. People hear things they can't explain, echoes that don't bounce back correctly, footsteps that repeat in patterns that don't match their own, voices that imitate someone you trust. I stepped closer. The ground vibrated faintly, not the breathing this time. This was different. This vibration was fast, rhythmic, like something skittering against metal deep inside the tunnel. Tap, 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 tap. It echoed strangely, not outward but inward, as if the tunnel swallowed the sound instead of projecting it. I lifted my flashlight and scanned the entrance. My beam landed on something half buried beside the rocks. A glove. Blue, torn at the fingertips. Elena's. I knew it instantly. I remembered the stitched initials on the palm. EM she'd shown me the day she arrived, a gift from her sister. My stomach twisted. The glove was warm. I froze. Warm, not frozen, not cold, warm. I pulled my hand back like I'd touched a burner. My throat tightened with a kind of fear I hadn't felt since the night we lost her. Something in me cracked open. I had spent 2 years wondering what happened to her, and now for the first time, something in the forest was answering. I stepped into the mine. The temperature dropped 10 degrees instantly. Frost formed on my eyelashes again, my breath fogged thick and heavy. The darkness ahead felt like a solid wall my light couldn't penetrate. The smell of sulfur intensified. The tapping echoed deeper. My boots crunched on old rails embedded in the ground. I swept the light across the interior. Support beams sagged. Rusted metal carts lay on their sides. Pickaxes covered in decades of dust leaned against the wall as if their owners might return any moment. But the dust wasn't undisturbed. There were trails through it. Drag marks. Deep. Fresh. A thin line where something heavy had been pulled deeper into the mine. My grip tightened around my flashlight until my knuckles ached. The dragging continued ahead. A faint rasping sound accompanied by a soft wet scrape like something being hauled inch by inch across stone. And underneath it, breathing. Not human. Not animal. Something larger. Something with multiple lungs or chambers or airways I couldn't understand. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to get out, to call this in and let someone else face whatever waited in the dark. But that glove, still warm in the snow, kept me moving forward. I followed the rails deeper. The tunnel narrowed. My shoulders brushed the walls. More drag marks crisscrossed in chaotic patterns. Some looked like a person had been pulled on their back. Others, no shape I recognized. And then the voices started. Not one. Many. Dozens. Whispers in the stone, layered, blending, impossible to locate. Some sounded like Elena. Some like children. Some like men with water in their lungs. "Nathan, turn around. Come closer. You're late. You knew the route always takes longer. You knew." I felt dizzy, lightheaded. My vision trembled. My pulse roared in my ears. Whispers poured from tiny cracks from the walls, from the ground beneath my feet. They rose and fell like a hive of trapped insects. The smell of burnt hair returned suddenly, so strong it stung my eyes. And then a hand touched my shoulder. Cold, light, deliberate. I spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly. No one was there, but the feeling of fingers lingered, an icy imprint etched into my skin through the layers of my jacket. My breath shook. I moved deeper. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, one I didn't recognize from any old mining maps. My light spilled over rock formations that looked too smooth, too symmetrical, as if carved by something other than tools. And in the middle of the chamber lay a pile of clothing. Park ranger greens, jackets, pants, shirts, torn, burned, shredded. A badge glinted near the top. My badge. The number on the metal shone back at me, the exact number pinned to my chest right now. I stepped back, heart slamming against my ribs. My radio hissed to life again. Nathan? This time the voice was clear. It was Elena. Not the warped mimicry from earlier. Not the distorted echo dragged through wires. This sounded like her. Breathless. Close. Nathan, you should have run. A scraping sound erupted behind me. Metal nails or bone claws raking across stone in a violent, hungry pull. The chamber shook. A gust of hot, foul air blasted past my face. Something massive moved in the darkness just beyond my light's reach. I didn't dare aim the flashlight at it. I didn't want to see it. Not yet. Because something old inside me, something primal and fragile, knew that whatever shape my light revealed would be the last thing I ever understood. So I closed my eyes, breathed once, and turned the beam slowly toward the sound. The beam sliced across the chamber, jittering slightly from the tremor in my hand. As the light swept upward, shadows broke apart like startled birds, revealing stone, metal, dust. Nothing alive, nothing moving. For a second, I wondered if my mind had finally split under the weight of this place, like if the sounds were in my head. Then my light crossed the far wall, and something pulled back. Not fast, not startled, slowly, deliberately. A shape retreating from the beam as though the light caused it discomfort, not fear. Its outline stretched upward unnaturally, limbs too long, bending in ways that implied joints where joints shouldn't exist. I couldn't see its face. Only the way the darkness clung to it, refusing to give me the clarity my eyes begged for. My mouth dried. My fingers went numb on the flashlight. The thing tilted its head, a soft scrape like bone against stone. Then it stepped forward. One impossibly slow step. The chamber's air thickened, pressing against my chest with invisible weight. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs didn't respond. Something about its movement, smooth, unbroken, fluid, transfixed me with a cold that felt like it was seeping into my nerves. The creature, or whatever it was, lowered itself, folding those long limbs until its head hovered near the ground. It crawled forward, its arms and legs contorting like it was testing the range of its own anatomy. The breath that escaped it was wet and rattling, a sound like exhaled gravel. Then, Nathan. The voice came from behind me. I spun around so violently I nearly dropped the light. Elena stood at the tunnel entrance, her silhouette at least, her ranger hat, her coat, her posture. Even the slight dip of her left shoulder, something I always teased her about during training. But her face was wrong. It wasn't a face at all, just a smooth, pale surface like clay that hadn't been molded yet. A single indentation where a mouth might begin if someone pressed a thumb into damp soil, her head cocked to the side with the same tilt the creature had used. The voice came from the indentation. "Nathan, why didn't you come sooner?" The creature behind me hissed, not at her but at me, as though I had violated some rule by turning away. I stumbled backward, placing myself between the two forms, neither of which I understood and both of which felt familiar in ways that poisoned my stomach. Elena, or the thing pretending to be her, stepped closer. The sound of her boots on stone was wrong. Too soft, too delayed, as though the noise came a heartbeat after the motion. I raised my flashlight out of instinct and pointed it directly at her. She didn't flinch. Instead, the indentation where her mouth should be widened. Not a smile, not anything human, just an opening that peeled horizontally across her featureless face. A second mouth began forming on her neck, a third on her chest. Each one spoke with a different tone. "You left me. You came back. You shouldn't have. It's hungry. It's listening. It waits." Every voice echoed through the chamber, bouncing off stone and metal until they became a chorus that clawed at the inside of my skull. Something in me broke, not snapped, not shattered, more like a seam tearing open, letting out everything I had kept sealed for 2 years. The guilt, the doubt, the endless nights replaying her final radio call, wondering if one more minute, one more decision, one more step would have changed her fate. A sound like bones splitting cracked behind me. The tall creature was rising to its full height now. My flashlight caught only patches of its surface. skin like wet slate, limbs bending backward one moment and forward the next, as though its body rewrote itself with each breath. When it exhaled, the smell of burnt hair rushed over me. Elena's imitation took another step, and her 3 mouths whispered in unity. It remembers you. I backed up until my shoulders hit the cold stone wall. The flashlight flickered in my grip. The battery warning beeped, almost apologetic in its timing. The 2 shapes, one towering, one pretending to be someone I once promised to protect, began to converge toward me. Not attacking, not rushing, just closing in. A sound like fabric shifting under dirt rose from the floor. The ground trembled beneath me, not breathing this time, but pulsing, like veins pumping something warm beneath the rock. I could feel it through my boots, through the soles, up my calves, a heartbeat. Not mine, not human. The entire mine had a pulse, and something in the chamber responded to it. The creature's limbs elongated with each thump, twisting outward as if drawn by the rhythm. Its head cocked again, listening. The Elena thing lifted its arms in imitation, tilting its blank face toward the ceiling. The voices from its mouths harmonized with the pulse, a sickening, melodic chant. Come down, come down, come down. The chamber ceiling groaned. Something above me shifted. Dust rained down. Pebbles. A crack split across the rock overhead. Then a hand pushed through, not a human hand. Something with too many fingers and joints like hinges in a rusted gate. It reached downward, searching, blindly grasping at the air. Its skin was translucent, veins pulsing with the same rhythm as the heartbeat under my feet. My legs finally responded. I ran. Not toward the tunnel I entered from. That would have taken me toward the Elena thing. I sprinted toward a narrow side passage barely visible in the dark. My flashlight flickered again, dying completely as I crossed the threshold. The moment light disappeared, the mind groaned, and everything inside it reacted. The chant from behind rose into a frenzy. The creature shrieked with a wet, splintering sound that echoed like 100 bones cracking at once. The giant hand thrashed violently, tearing at the ceiling. I shoved myself into the side tunnel, scraping my shoulders on jagged walls. The darkness was absolute, thick, suffocating, swallowing every hint of direction. I ran blind, one hand on the wall, the other outstretched. My breath came in short, sharp bursts that echoed too loudly. Behind me, something entered the passage. I heard it drag its limbs on the ground with a crawling, convulsing motion. The sound echoed closer, faster than I could run. Something brushed my ankle. I kicked wildly, nearly tripping. My glove scraped rock. My knee slammed into a sharp outcrop. Pain ripped up my leg, but I forced myself forward. A faint orange glow appeared ahead, dull, flickering. I didn't trust it, but I had no choice. I staggered toward it until the tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller, circular, walls smoothed unnaturally. The glow came from a crack in the stone where some chemical or fungus emitted sickly light. And in the center of the chamber stood a figure, a man, tall, motionless. He wore a ranger uniform, not just any uniform, mine. My nameplate, my badge, my jacket, all of it. He looked like me, but older, exhausted, eyes hollowed and sunken like someone who had stared into the dark far too long. He raised a finger to his lips. Shh! I couldn't breathe. Behind me, the creature crawled closer, the sound of wet limbs scraping stone echoing through the tunnel. The older version of me tilted his head and whispered, "You don't make it out this time." He stepped backward into the stone and vanished. The scrape behind me stopped, silence, total perfect silence. Then from the darkness of the tunnel, Nathan. But this time the voice was my own. I didn't turn toward the voice. Not at first. Some instinct older than language held me frozen, teaching me that predators call you by name only when they want you to look. Whatever waited in that darkness had borrowed every voice I feared losing, and now it was trying on the one voice I trusted most. Mine. Nathan, come here. No echo, no distortion, just my tone, my cadence, my breath. I pressed my back against the smooth stone wall and felt warmth pulsing through it. Not natural warmth, something like blood running behind a thin membrane. The chamber seemed to inhale around me. The air grew thick, humid, heavy, with the smell of wet fur and rusted metal. Every breath felt stolen from some deeper throat, exhaling through mine. The tunnel behind me rustled again, lightless movement. The scrape of two long limbs sweeping across the floor. Then my voice spoke again, but closer this time. Come on, we've done this before. I clenched my jaw so tight the muscles ached. My heartbeat pounded through my ribs, loud enough that I feared it would expose me. I looked toward the chamber's faint chemical glow, the only thing giving shape to the walls. The orange light pulsed in time with the heartbeat beneath my boots, making the whole room feel like a living cavity, an organ hollowed out for something to nest inside. Something shifted within the crack of glowing stone. A ripple. A shudder. A shadow moving behind it. I stepped away fast, too fast, and the motion echoed. The scrape behind me stopped abruptly, as if the thing hunting me had paused to listen, to wait for the next sound. The next mistake. My breathing sounded too loud. I cupped my hands over my mouth to muffle it. Sweat trickled cold down my spine despite the heat radiating from the chamber walls. My legs trembled, torn between flight and collapse. Nathan. My voice again, but whispering now. Taunting, the way I'd mutter to myself while working overtime reports. Casual, familiar, it made my stomach twist in a way no monster or illusion ever had. Then a second voice joined it, my voice again, but hoarse, exhausted, the way it had sounded during the week after Elena disappeared. When I barely slept, when I blamed myself for every missing step. Turn around, stop running. Footsteps, or the imitation of footsteps, echoed softly through the passage. Deliberate, slow. I backed toward the opposite wall. The glow intensified for a moment, flickering like candlelight behind a thin sheet. A dark shape pressed against the illuminated membrane, stretching it from the other side. A vaguely human outline, arms, legs, a head pushing forward as if trying to force itself through. I stumbled back, shoes scraping stone, and the footsteps in the tunnel froze again. Then came the breath. Not human, not animal, a deep, resonant, dragging inhale that vibrated the chamber walls. Dust fell from the ceiling. The shape behind the membrane writhed, pushing harder. It wants you. That voice wasn't mine. That voice wasn't Alina's. That voice came from the stone itself. I snapped. I bolted. There was no plan, just primal survival. I sprinted toward the tunnel opposite the one I'd entered from, not caring where it led. My hands slid along the stone, catching on sharp edges. Pain streaked up my arm as skin split under my glove, but I kept moving. The chamber behind me erupted. Something crashed against the walls, bones or rocks shattered. Screeches, human and not, layered together in a chorus that tore through the mind like a storm. The heartbeat in the ground quickened, thundering now, a stampede of pulses. Something followed. Its limbs slammed against stone, scraping, pulling, accelerating in chaotic bursts. Its breathing was ragged, snarled, eager. I sprinted down the narrowing tunnel until the ceiling dipped low enough that I had to crouch. My flashlight was dead, but faint orange light pulsed behind me, chasing me like a dying sun. The tunnel floor shifted under my feet, turning from solid stone to packed earth. Then softer, like mud. Then softer still, like wet tissue. I slid, hands sinking into something spongy. The smell of sulfur and decay rose so fast it made me gag. The heartbeat sounded closer, louder. Ahead, the tunnel split. Left, darkness. Right, darkness. No difference, no guidance. Behind me, a shape scraped against the walls, dragging itself closer with ecstatic grunts. Nathan. 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 My name became a chant, repeating in a dozen mismatched tones. I chose right. My shoulder slammed a wall, sending sparks of pain through my vision. The tunnel narrowed to the width of my body. I squeezed through, twisting sideways, tearing fabric on jagged stone. Behind me, something forced itself into the narrow passage, crushing rock with wet, eager snaps. I crawled, dragging myself forward with shaking arms. My knees slid across gravel and damp soil, each movement fueled by terror and the distant hope that the surface was somewhere ahead. Somewhere reachable, somewhere real. The tunnel angled upward. My heart surged with desperate relief. Up meant out. Up meant air that didn't taste like death. Up meant the forest, even if the forest was no safer. I clawed my way upward, rocks scraping my palms, The tunnel widened enough for me to stand, hunched. My lungs burned with each breath, my throat raw from sulfur and panic. Behind me, something screamed. It wasn't the creature, or maybe it was, maybe this was its true voice. But it sounded like 100 people screaming through a single throat, each one begging, warning, pleading. Do not leave. I ran harder. Cold air brushed my face, real air, thin and sharp, a shift in pressure, a promise of open space. I pushed forward, squeezing past a final tight bend, and stumbled out onto snow. Night, clear sky, stars. The forest stretched around me, silent, blanketed in frost. The mine entrance I had emerged from was a jagged crack in a hillside I didn't recognize. I staggered into the open, gasping. Behind me, the mine exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. Snow around the entrance shifted in slow pulses. Breathing. I backed away, boots crunching. My legs felt rubbery, vision blurred by tears and cold and whatever had followed me through those tunnels. The crack in the stone sealed, not fast, not magically, but gradually as though something beneath it was pulling the rock back into place. The last thing I saw inside that closing gap was the hint of movement, a silhouette, standing motionless, watching me, my silhouette, older, hollow-eyed, smiling with a mouth I didn't remember having. Then the mountain swallowed it whole. The forest returned to silence. I forced myself down the hillside, every step jarring pain through my bones. I didn't know how long I walked. Time stretched unnaturally, distances shifting. The woods around me felt unfamiliar, rearranged, as though the land had turned itself inside out to confuse me. When I finally reached the trailhead sign, dawn was breaking. Except the sign marking Route 13 was different, newer. The date on the maintenance log sheet stapled to it read 3 years ahead of the date I remembered. My signature was on the line for the latest patrol, but I had no memory of signing it. My legs buckled. I grabbed the post to steady myself. Snow melted beneath my glove. The ground inhaled, exhaled once, slow and steady, as though welcoming me back. My radio crackled. My voice spoke softly. Told you. The route always takes longer than it should. The forest held its breath. And I finally understood. I had never outrun anything in those tunnels. I had only ever been walking in circles. His flashlight kept dimming long before I ever understood why. But if I'm being honest, the darkness around here had been changing long before that. It took me years to admit it. Years of brushing off what I saw, what I heard, what I felt, sliding just beyond the edge of my own confidence. My name is Kyle. I'm 37, and I've spent most of my adult life working as a forest ranger in the northern ranges of Montana. Dense, punishing land where the trees swallow sound and sight, and the weather has a way of testing the parts of you that you don't show anyone. I used to think that being afraid out here meant you weren't cut out for the job. Now I know the opposite is true. If the woods don't scare you a little, you're not paying attention. I took the post when I was 24, still too stubborn to feel afraid, still convinced that skill and toughness were enough to handle anything the backcountry threw at me. The locals tried to warn me in their own roundabout way. Older guys, loggers, ranch hands, a few retired smoke jumpers, would sit near the back of the diner and talk in low voices about things they'd seen but didn't want to explain. A set of footprints where there shouldn't have been any. Sudden, windless silence in the middle of a storm. Something knocking on the side of a cabin around 3 a.m. Nobody said the word, but everyone knew it. They said big or tall or not a bear, because naming something gives it power, and out here, power gets you killed. The forest district they assigned me to was huge, too big for any one ranger to realistically cover. But there was a stretch I always felt drawn to. This long valley carved between two ridges that ran so close together the sun barely slipped through except at noon. Locals avoided it without making a big fuss, like someone stepping around a grave out of habit, not superstition. My station overlooked the entrance. A small cabin, one room with a sagging porch and a solar-powered lamp that flickered when the wind cut through. The first few nights I stayed there, that lamp pulsed like a dying heartbeat. I chalked it up to faulty wiring. I didn't realize then how many things I'd eventually blame on faulty wiring. The first story, the first real encounter, started with a sound. Always the sound. I remember that night down to the temperature, the smell, the way the fog curled along the valley floor like something crawling forward. I'd been doing rounds near the creek, about an hour before midnight. It was a warm evening, unseasonably warm, the kind that felt wrong on the skin. The air had that sweet, heavy scent of rotting leaves soaked in water, and the wind had dropped completely. No rustling, no insects. Just the silence that presses so tightly against you, it feels like the woods are listening. I'd stopped to check a bridge that tended to flood after storms, and while I was kneeling near the planks, I heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, heavy. Not quite wood on wood. More like knuckles on wet bark. The knocks came from the other side of the creek. I'd met campers who tried to mess with rangers for fun, but this was deep in the valley. No campsites nearby. No trails that didn't dead end into thick underbrush. Nobody should have been there, and certainly not in that direction. I shined my flashlight across the water. At first, all I saw was fog. Then the beam dimmed. Just a flicker at first, like a loose battery connection. I smacked the side of the light, and it brightened again, but only for a second. Then it faded to a weak glow, barely reaching past my boots. Behind me, branches cracked. Not fallen, stepped on. I turned around slowly, holding the fading beam up like it meant something, like that thin slice of light could protect me. I didn't see anything, but the smell changed. The rot in the air sharpened into something almost metallic, like wet iron. A breeze brushed the back of my neck, but the trees remained perfectly still. I whispered, "Anyone there?" I don't know why I whispered. Some part of me already understood that speaking loudly would have felt like provoking something. The knocks came again, but closer. Not across the creek. Behind me now. 3 knocks, slow and absolute. I spun around just as the flashlight gave out completely. Total darkness swallowed me, thick and directionless. For a moment, I couldn't even hear my own breathing over the rush of blood in my ears. I dropped to one knee, trying to stay calm, trying to rationalize. Maybe the batteries were dead. Maybe someone out here needed help. Maybe a bear was testing its surroundings. Reason is a fragile thing, and mine was cracking like thin ice. Then something exhaled beside me. Hot, damp air brushed my cheek, and every instinct I had screamed at me to run. I didn't. Not yet. Training held me still. I forced myself to stay low and slowly reached into my pack for the spare flashlight. But my fingers were shaking, slipping off the zipper, fumbling like they belonged to someone else. The breath against my cheek vanished, and for a second I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Then a hand. No, not a hand. Something larger. Closed around the back of my jacket and lifted. I didn't yell. I couldn't. My mind went blank except for one thought. This thing is taller than anything I've ever seen. It dropped me almost immediately, like it was tasting the idea of grabbing me and then reconsidered. I hit the ground hard, rolled toward the creek, and managed to yank the spare flashlight free. I flipped it on, and the beam shot out strong and clear. But nothing was there. No footprints, no movement. Just fog and trees and the overwhelming certainty that something had just stepped back into the dark, watching me from a place where light couldn't reach. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the cabin with every lamp on, staring at the door, waiting for 3 knocks. They never came. But from then on, I noticed the locals watching me differently. It was subtle in the way they asked where I'd been patrolling, in the way they paused before answering. They knew that valley. They knew the things that lived in the parts of the forest that didn't belong to us. But I kept going back, partly out of responsibility, partly out of pride, and partly because somewhere inside me an old, unhealed fear was waking up, and I needed to understand why. 2 months after that night, the next story unfolded, if you could call it a story. It was more like a peeling away of excuses, a moment when my mind stopped trying to explain the impossible and started listening to it. It began with a smell, not the metallic rot from before, This was worse, thick, warm, almost like the breath of something feverish. I picked it up while hiking toward a cave system near the West Ridge, a set of narrow tunnels locals treated like a curse nobody wanted to repeat. They never gave me a reason, never told me a story, just shook their heads and said those caves weren't meant to be mapped. I should have listened. The smell seeped from the entrance like the cave was breathing, a low, steady pulse of air brushing past me, carrying that sick heat with it. I tried shining my flashlight in, but the beam trembled, weaker than it had any right to be. I thought maybe the batteries were defective. 3 new lights, 3 weeks in a row, all having the same problem. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that the closer I got to the cave, the more the lights struggled, like something inside didn't want to be seen. The temperature dropped 5 degrees as I stepped in, then 10. My breath fogged instantly. The walls glistened with moisture, and every sound I made echoed too far, bouncing deeper into the dark than should have been possible. I only meant to walk in a few feet, just to document structural changes after a small quake earlier in the season, but the smell intensified, coating the back of my throat. My fingers numbed. The darkness looked thicker, almost textured. Then I heard it. Not knocking this time, whispering, but not words, more like breathing shaped into intent. My heart thudded, and I stepped backward. My flashlight dimmed again. I shook it, cursed under my breath, and backed toward the entrance. That whispering followed, growing louder, as if something massive scraped its body along the walls, pulling itself toward me. The beam flickered. Once, twice, then died. And I heard a single footstep inside the cave, heavy, deliberate. That was the first time I truly broke. Panic ripped through me like ice water. I lunged toward the entrance, hands scraping rock, shoulder slamming against the cave mouth. I stumbled into daylight just as something enormous reached the threshold, but did not cross it. The sunlight hit the ground between us, and the whispering stopped instantly, replaced by a low growl that shook dust from the rocks. I didn't look back as I ran. I didn't need to. The presence in that cave stayed just out of sight, but I felt its attention like a hook dragging along my spine. It wasn't the last time it followed me. It wasn't even the closest. But from that day on, whenever my flashlight dimmed, even for a second, I knew it meant only one thing: it was near. Every ranger I knew had a story about following their instincts. Stories of trusting, a subtle shift in the wind, a sudden silence in the brush, or the feeling of being watched. But for years I convinced myself that instinct was just experience dressed up in superstition. That changed after the cave. Something in me cracked open that day, a thin seam between reason and fear, and whatever stood inside that cave reached right through it. I carried that sensation with me every time I stepped into the valley afterward, like a phantom hand resting between my shoulder blades. The next time the flashlight dimmed, I wasn't even in the thick of anything. No caves, no fog, no strange knocks. Just a search and check assignment after a late-season thunderstorm had blown through our unit. Lightning had taken out a cluster of old-growth pines, and I needed to assess the trail damage and check for stranded hikers. I wasn't expecting any trouble. Storms usually scared people off for a few days, but when I walked past the 2nd-mile marker, I felt it. That small, almost imperceptible tug at the edge of my awareness. The air cooled. My steps fell quieter. My breath fogged in a way that didn't match the temperature. And then the flashlight dimmed, a steady, ruthless drop in the beam, like someone was holding a hand over the lens and pressing down until the light suffocated. I fought the urge to turn around. You can't do your job in the forest if you bolt at every shadow. That's how rangers get hurt, or worse. So I kept walking, keeping the trail in sight, even as the trees seemed to push in on both sides. The limbs arched overhead, blocking out more sky than they should have, and I remember thinking, even before the fear truly set in, that the woods felt wrong, tilted, unbalanced. Then I smelled it again. Not the rot from the creek night, not the fever smell from the cave. Something new. A scent like wet fur and ash, almost burnt but earthy beneath it. like a creature that had spent too long sleeping near a fire that never went out. The wind wasn't blowing, yet the smell moved around me, circling, tightening. Every instinct I had screamed to leave the trail and move toward open space, but I stayed my course, breath held, listening. Nothing. Not a branch, not a chirp, not a single rustle in the undergrowth, until the scream tore through the trees. It wasn't human, but it sounded close, like a voice stretched beyond its natural range, cracking mid-wail, rising into a pitch that made my teeth ache. I dropped to a crouch without thinking, shining the thinning beam toward the sound. But the flashlight flickered violently and dimmed further, barely offering a glow. Then the woods erupted in movement. Branches snapped on both sides of the trail as if something massive was circling me. Leaves trembled, dirt displaced. I spun, trying to pin down the source, but the flashlight guttered again, so faint now that it only illuminated the few feet directly in front of my boots. That was when I heard the second scream. Closer, lower, angrier. Whatever it belonged to, it wasn't alone. My pulse hammered so hard my fingers tingled. Every step I took forward felt like stepping deeper into the mouth of something. I could sense more than one presence pacing the tree line, moving with unnatural precision, matching each other's rhythm as if coordinated. Something exhaled from the left, a heavy, rumbling breath, another from the right. Then the smell hit me again, stronger this time, acidic and smoky, and I knew with absolute clarity that if my light died completely, I wouldn't make it out. The trail opened into a small clearing 100 feet ahead. I couldn't see it, but I remembered it being there from past patrols. It was my only chance. I forced my legs to move faster, slipping on rain-softened soil as the unseen shapes pressed closer. I felt heat near my hip, something brushing me, powerful and intentional, and I stumbled, catching myself on a fallen branch. My flashlight sputtered. Died. I froze. Terror washed over me so completely I couldn't breathe. Darkness wrapped around me like a fist tightening. Then, out of nowhere, the sky cracked open with a tremor of distant thunder, and lightning flashed across the ridge. That split second of white-blue light revealed something in the woods to my right. Tall. Too tall. Shoulders hunched, back fur matted and glistening, arms long enough to reach its knees. A silhouette like a man stretched upward by something cruel, proportions wrong, head slightly tilted toward me as if studying my reaction. Its eyes reflected the lightning. Not amber. Not green. White. Perfect. Gleaming white, like bone catching moonlight. The bolt faded, plunging the forest back into black. But I could hear it move, one slow step, then another, its weight making the earth shift beneath my boots. I fumbled for my pack, ripping it open with shaking hands, searching for the emergency flare. When my fingers wrapped around the cylinder, I nearly sobbed with relief. I raked the cap against the striker, and a burst of red light flared alive, hot and hissing. For a heartbeat, the clearing filled with crimson glow. I saw them. Not one, 3, all standing just beyond the nearest line of trees, all tall, all broad, their shapes like nightmares carved from muscle and shadow. Their fur rippled in the wind that wasn't blowing. Their faces were angled, more human than any bear, more animal than any man. One leaned forward, and in the red glow I saw the outline of teeth, long, curved, made for tearing. They didn't scream this time. They didn't need to. The one closest to me stepped forward slowly, testing the boundary of the flare's reach. I could hear its breathing, deep, deliberate, a sound full of patience and hunger. The flare hissed louder, burning down too fast. I backed away, moving toward the clearing I knew was behind me, the red light weakening by the second. When the flare died, I expected them to rush me, but they didn't. They just stopped, watching, waiting. Like something else had their attention. I didn't know it then, but this wasn't the night they wanted me. It was just the night they wanted me to understand that I didn't control anything out here. Not the trail, not the darkness, not even my own fear. I reached the clearing, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my teeth. And as soon as I broke through the densest line of trees, everything changed. The air warmed. The smell vanished. The forest behind me fell silent. Not peaceful, but paused, like whatever had followed me had chosen to stay in the shadow of the trees. I didn't look back. Not once. The next morning, when the sun rose, I returned with 2 other rangers. They found nothing. No prints, no broken branches, no scorch marks from the flare, nothing to prove what I'd seen. But the ground where I'd dropped to my knees was warm. Not sun-warmed. Body-warm. As if something had been standing there long after I ran. Something with enough heat to thaw earth in a 50-foot radius. That was the moment I realized something deeper. Whatever followed me wasn't hunting me randomly. It chose its moments. It waited, it watched, and it was getting closer. I didn't tell the other rangers what I felt in that circle of thawed earth. Not because they wouldn't believe me. Some of them would have, maybe. But because saying it out loud might have forced me to accept that I was no longer dealing with something I could outrun, outthink, or explain away. Instead, I lied and said it must have been a pocket of ground warmed by decomposition. One of the guys nodded like it made sense. The other gave me a look, a long one, the kind that said he'd heard that explanation before and didn't buy it then, either. I stopped sleeping in the cabin for a few weeks after that. I slept in my truck, seat leaned back, windows cracked an inch. It felt safer, even though I knew it wasn't. Metal doors don't stop the things that live in a forest like this. But the truck at least gave me the illusion of control. A wheel I could grip, an ignition I could turn, a way out if something came knocking. Which, eventually, something did. It was late November when I finally returned to the valley cabin. The snow had started to gather on the ridge lines, and the wind carried the brittle smell of winter. Clean, sharp, capable of stripping away the smaller scents that usually warned me something was near. I'd convinced myself that the creatures, whatever they were, behaved seasonally, that they went deeper into the mountains once the cold arrived, that they hibernated, migrated, buried themselves in caves too far from human reach. It was a lie, and part of me already knew that. The first night back in the cabin proved it. I'd just finished logging fire weather data when it happened. The temperature inside the cabin dipped so drastically my breath turned to fog. The old solar lamp outside flickered through the window, pulsing every few seconds like a weak heartbeat. The shadows inside the cabin felt stretched, as if someone had pulled them toward the door. At first I thought I was imagining it. Stress, fatigue, the cave, the clearing. My mind stitching together fear into shapes. Then the knocking started. Not 3 knocks like before. 1, a single heavy thump against the front door. I froze at the table, pen still in hand, pulse stuttering. I waited, listening. Nothing. No wind. No footsteps on the porch, just the low groan of the cabin settling. Then another thump. Louder. More deliberate. I stood up slowly, pulse beating in my throat. The lamp outside flickered again. I reached for my flashlight on instinct, and as soon as my fingers brushed the metal, the beam weakened. Just a faint glow trembling in the lens. A third thump rattled the door frame. I approached the door carefully, listening for breath, movement, anything. But the thing at the door was quiet, patient. It wanted me to open it. Wanted to see if I was the kind of man who obeyed a knock. I didn't open it. But I did something just as stupid. I looked out the small window beside the door. Nothing. Just darkness and blowing snow. The lamp pulsed once more, lighting the porch for a split second. And that was when I saw it. A shape standing just beyond the circle of light. Tall. Still. The snow falling over it, but never on it, as if the flakes drifted around its outline instead of touching it. The head was too high to belong to a man, the shoulders too broad. And I swear, even though the lamp flickered so fast I questioned it, the eyes were visible in that instant. White, luminous, reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. I stepped back from the window, heart slamming hard enough to shake my ribs. The flashlight flickered in my hand. No matter how many times I smacked it, the beam only dimmed further. The air grew heavier, richer with that scent I'd come to associate with it, wet fur and ash. Another thump hit the door, slow and steady. I knew in the oldest, most primal part of me that if the flashlight died completely, something on the other side would come through. So I turned on every light in the cabin. The desk lamp, the overhead bulb, even the stove's pilot light seemed brighter. And for a moment, the knocking stopped. The presence outside shifted. Then it left. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't see movement. But the weight of it, the oppressive tension, slipped away like a receding tide. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting in the corner with my back pressed against the wall, flashlight in my hand, refusing to blink. When the sun finally rose, I stepped onto the porch and saw what I'd refused to check the night before. Tracks. Massive ones. Not human, not bear, not cougar. 3 sets leading from the trees to my door. But the strangest part? There were no tracks leading away. Not a single one. It was as if the creatures approached from the forest, but left by some other means, or never left at all. For 3 days after that, I avoided the valley entirely. I patrolled the higher ridges, the exposed slopes, the burned areas, anywhere with light and sight lines and the comfort of knowing nothing tall enough to stare into my window could hide behind a tree. But a ranger's job isn't just patrolling. There are calls, reports, responsibilities. And on the 4th morning, dispatch radioed in a call about a missing photographer last seen hiking near the caves. My caves, my valley, my responsibility. I almost pretended I didn't hear the call. Almost said I was too far away, that another unit should take it. But you don't abandon someone out here. You don't turn your back on a person because of what might be waiting for you. I grabbed my gear, double-checked every spare battery, packed 3 flares instead of 1, and drove toward the valley entrance with a knot of dread twisting tighter every mile. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, the cold hit differently, too sharp, like the air had edges. The forest was quiet again. No birds, no wind, but the flashlight stayed bright, strangely bright, brighter than it had been in weeks, and that terrified me more than anything, because it meant the creatures weren't hiding from the light this time. They didn't need to. I followed the photographer's last known path, scanning for tracks, gear, anything. The snow was patchy in some places, deep in others, and the forest felt wrong. Patterns of silence and sound that didn't line up with each other. I found a glove near the creek, a torn strap of a backpack near a spruce, a lens cap embedded in the snow, then a trail of footprints. The photographer's boots, and something else beside them, something enormous. Something walking parallel to him the entire way. The prints branched off toward a ravine that led straight to the cave system. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to go in there again, but the tracks gave me no choice. I radioed my position, tightened the straps on my pack, and moved forward. Each step toward the caves raised the hair along my arms. The flashlight flickered once, twice. Not enough to fail, but enough to warn me. The smell seeped into the air again, feverish, hot, pulsing. The cave entrance appeared through a drift of snow, black and open like a wound in the earth. Near the mouth of the cave lay the photographer's second glove, and beside it, a handprint, huge, wide, fingers ending in deep indentations like claws pressed into the frozen dirt, fresh, still warm. I crouched down slowly, breath trembling out in clouds. My flashlight dimmed again, and then something breathed from inside the cave. Not loudly, not aggressively, just close. So close I felt the air move across my face. I steadied myself, heart pounding harder with each inhale, knowing that whatever waited inside wasn't going to let me turn around this time. Something had changed. This wasn't a warning. It wasn't a test. It was an invitation. I stepped inside the cave like a man walking into a trap he knows he cannot escape. The temperature dropped instantly, cold biting into my neck and hands. My flashlight sputtered, then held steady, a narrow beam barely piercing the thick darkness. The walls glistened with moisture, and every sound, my boots crunching on gravel, my own shallow breaths, echoed unnaturally, stretched and distorted. The forest outside felt like a distant memory, replaced by this oppressive, silent world that seemed to breathe along with me. I moved slowly, following the handprints pressed into the mud near the entrance. They weren't the photographer's. They were too large, the shape wrong, elongated, with sharp impressions where claws might have been, and they led deeper into the cave system than I had ever dared go before. The flashlight flickered, and with each pulse, the shadows seemed to twist into forms. Tall, hunched silhouettes crouching just beyond the reach of light, watching. My throat went dry, my stomach clenched, and yet some part of me couldn't stop moving forward. After a few hundred feet, the cave opened into a wider chamber. I paused, scanning the walls. Stalactites dripped water, the sound amplified in the cavern, and then I heard it, a low, guttural hum vibrating through the stone floor. Not a growl, not a roar, but a resonance that seemed to press against my chest, clawing at my ribs. It was rhythmical, deliberate, like something was calling out to me, or testing me, or warning me. I could feel its eyes on me even before I saw it. And then I did. In the corner of the chamber, a figure loomed, massive, impossibly tall, hunched, fur darkened and matted. Its face was shadowed, but the glint of white eyes caught the beam of my flashlight. They weren't just watching, they were calculating. Patiently, it shifted, a movement smooth and terrifyingly precise, too controlled for any animal I had ever known. I could hear its breathing, shallow yet resonant, the warmth of it rolling toward me in pulses. My mind screamed at me to turn and run. Every survival instinct in my body shouted the same message. But the path back was narrow, lined with sharp rocks and treacherous footing, and I knew that running blindly might make me stumble, give it the advantage. I forced myself to stay low, to move deliberately, keeping the beam on it, watching for any sudden motion. The hum continued, almost musical now, vibrating through my skull. And then I heard the photographer, a faint moan, muffled, coming from deeper in the chamber. My heart skipped. I rushed toward the sound, my boots slipping on wet stone. The figure did not move immediately. It let me pass, letting me think I had an opening. But the moment I turned a bend in the cavern, the flashlight flickered violently, and I felt it. Massive, solid, brushing past the side of my body. I stumbled forward, almost losing the light, almost falling into the darkness. The photographer's groan became clearer. He was lying face down, trembling, a rope of some sort coiled around his ankle like it had been dragged. I rushed to him, flashlight shaking, flaring across the wet walls, and reached down to grab his shoulder. His eyes opened, wide with terror, but his lips moved too slow, whispering something I couldn't hear over my own rapid breathing. Then I felt it again, a presence pressing against my back, impossibly heavy. My flashlight dimmed. My hands shook as I helped the photographer to his feet. He was light, almost frail, but alive. That much I knew. But the cave, it wasn't done with us. I could feel the heat, the intention, the way it prowled behind us, just out of view, matching every step. I started back, careful not to stumble. Every so often, like the light would flicker, and in those brief gaps, I thought I saw shapes closing in. Always at the periphery of my vision, always just outside the reach of reason. I tried talking, telling the photographer to stay calm, but the sound of my own voice felt inadequate, swallowed by the cave. We reached a narrowing tunnel. I thought this might be our escape, but the walls closed tighter, forcing us into single file. The pressure behind me grew heavier, a weight that pressed against my chest, against my mind. I kept moving, even as the flashlight dimmed further. I could almost feel its breath, hot and putrid, against the back of my neck. It didn't charge. It didn't roar. It just followed, patient, letting us believe we were making progress. Then the floor gave way to a shallow drop. Rocks slid under our boots. I stumbled, caught by the photographer. The flashlight flickered again, and in that fleeting burst of light, I saw the creature, not full, but enough. A hulking silhouette, arms too long, head cocked, eyes glinting in the half-light. And it smiled, or at least it bent its mouth in a way that resembled one. I almost lost it then. My instincts screamed for me to fight, to run, to do anything. But I couldn't. I couldn't move fast enough, couldn't think clearly. My mind was a fog of panic, confusion, and disbelief. I felt the photographer grasp my arm, pulling me forward, whispering something I couldn't make out. I moved. I followed. The tunnel ended at another chamber. Light from above, from a small fissure in the rock ceiling, spilled down in a narrow column. I shoved the photographer toward it. He scrambled upward, and I followed, fingers gripping cold stone, muscles screaming with the effort. I glanced back just in time to see the figure in the shadows shift and step toward the edge of the tunnel. But it did not follow us up. We emerged into daylight. Snow blanketed the ridge. Trees swayed in a weak wind. Silence. Absolute silence, broken only by our ragged breathing. The cave entrance yawned behind us, dark and unyielding. The photographer didn't speak for a long time. Neither did I. I watched the ridge, the valley below, the trees that hid every possible threat. My flashlight finally died in my grip. I realized then that fear is a living thing. It's not something you can rationalize away, not when it comes for you with patience, with intelligence, with intent. Out here, in these woods, the monsters aren't just in the shadows. They are the shadows. They are the weight you feel pressing on your back, the whisper in the wind, the flicker of a dying light. That day, when I returned the photographer to safety, when the warmth of civilization finally wrapped around us, I learned something I had never truly known. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is walking into it, step by step, knowing it could consume you, and still refusing to stop. The valley remains. The caves remain. And I still patrol those ridges, flashlight in hand, ears tuned to every unnatural sound, heart ready for the weight of presence in the dark. I do it not because I want to, not because I am fearless, but because someone has to bear witness. Someone has to survive it so others can continue to believe in the forest's beauty, even when it hides shadows we cannot name. I carry that lesson every time the flashlight dims. And I've learned that dimming isn't the end, it's the beginning, the moment when reason and fear collide, and when you choose finally to keep moving forward, even if you know the darkness is watching, even if you know the weight behind you is patient, even if you know you may not be alone, because moving forward is the only way to keep the light alive. This is the forest I guard. This is the darkness I face. This is the truth I carry.